Hey guys, tonight we dive nose first, literally, into one of the least sexy yet strangely fascinating periods in human intimacy, Tudor England. You're walking the narrow lanes of 16th century London under a pale moon, breathing in a cocktail of rotting fish, overflowing chamber pots, and the unmistakable stench of human ambition. Horse dung clings to your boots, and someone is loudly vomiting in the alley behind you. You think, maybe I took a wrong turn on the way to romance. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing who's drifting off across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle past a rickety wooden cart loaded with fly-swarmed meat, duck under a low beam that whacks your shoulder, and step into a world where everything smells slightly wrong. Your nose wrinkles, but nobody else seems to notice. Here, the air always smells like this. That's not perfume you're catching, it's the pungent reality of Tudor hygiene, or lack thereof. Let's be blunt, everything smells. The Thames River doubles as a toilet, laundromat, and dumping ground. People wash maybe once a month, and when they do, it's often with the same bucket they used to soak eel skins for dinner. You inch past a pair of laughing boys rolling a pig's bladder like a soccer ball, and wonder, again, why anyone would want to get undressed in this era. But they do. And they did. Frequently. It's easy to forget that the Tudors had sex drives just like anyone else. Maybe even more so, what with all that repression simmering beneath lace collars and scowling portraits. But between the damp bed linens, the cold drafty rooms, and the sheer amount of layers they had to peel off, petticoats, jerkins, codpieces, chemises, corsets, breeches, doublets, you start to understand why seduction wasn't exactly spontaneous. You're in someone's home now, a wealthier Londoner, judging by the carved wooden beams and slightly less filthy rushes on the floor. Still, it's dim and smoky. Candles flicker. The smell of old ale and mutton fat hovers in the air like a ghost. A couple shuffles past you toward a back room. That's their private space, which means a curtain instead of a wall, and maybe a wooden bed frame if they're lucky. It creaks just from looking at it. You step inside and your foot squelches into something soft. Don't ask. Now imagine trying to feel even a little romantic in this setting. Add to that a deep-rooted suspicion of bathing, which some believed opened the pores to disease. Cleanliness? Practically heresy. You dab yourself with a bit of rosemary water and hope for the best. Queen Elizabeth herself was said to bathe only once a month, whether she needed it or not. Historians still argue whether the average Tudor truly wanted to be clean or just didn't care. Was it lack of infrastructure or lack of interest? Either way, the result was the same. A city where scent lingered like smoke, and every encounter began with a full-body olfactory assault. Back on the street, you pass by a man relieving himself into a gutter. Nobody bats an eye. Further down, someone's emptying a chamber pot from a second-story window. "Gardez l'eau," they yell, a half-hearted warning that barely registers before it splashes. Yes, that's why people wore wide-brimmed hats and heavy cloaks. But don't get too smug. The concept of deodorant didn't exist yet, and most people, royalty included, used perfume only to mask the stench. Men carried pomanders, scented balls filled with herbs and wax swinging from their belts like medieval air fresheners. Women tucked lavender sachets into their bodices, right above corsets so tight they could barely breathe, let alone flirt. Still, flirtation happened. At church, at market, at May Day festivals full of cider and questionable choices. People made do. They whispered, they winked, they passed handkerchiefs, a gesture that was both oddly tender and frankly germ-spreading. And yes, people fell in love. Sometimes. More often, marriages were arranged like livestock deals. Your worth was measured in dowries, land, or social alliances. Your consent, a luxury item. But even within these grim alliances, intimacy occasionally blossomed, though usually without much fanfare. Courtship was cautious, scripted, and constantly surveilled. It was a high-stakes dance beneath the scrutiny of family, clergy, and occasionally the crown. The state took sex very seriously. For the Tudors, fornication wasn't just a sin, it was a crime. Public punishment was common. You could be paraded through the streets in a smock, beaten at the whipping post, or forced to wear a paper hat that read whore, while church bells rang mockingly overhead. Imagine trying to sneak off for a tryst, knowing that might be the result. And yet, somehow, they still did it. Human nature has a way of steamrolling prudish laws in impractical fashion. You overhear snatches of bawdy songs sung at taverns, carvings on bedposts that are surprisingly detailed, a knowing smirk between the alewife and the baker. Quirky fact: one popular belief held that having intercourse while standing up could prevent pregnancy. Another claimed that if a woman sneezed right after, conception would be avoided. You try to picture someone timing their sneeze between thrusts and quickly regret it. Of course, none of this accounts for the class divide. If you were nobility, you had more privacy, softer sheets, and sometimes even a bath. If you were poor, well, you probably shared your bed with family members, livestock, or both. The idea of alone time was foreign. People lived communally, and space was scarce. You learned to ignore things, or not. By now, you've passed into another house. This one has nicer furniture, a portrait of Henry VIII glaring down from above the hearth, and, luxury of luxuries, a chambermaid. She's pouring a bowl of rose-scented water, and it almost smells pleasant. Her master is preparing for bed. That means brushing lice out of his beard and setting aside the long codpiece that looks suspiciously like a weapon. The codpiece, a truly baffling Tudor invention. Supposedly to protect and highlight the mail package, it evolved from functional padding to near comical display. Some were even used to carry coins, notes, or tiny daggers. Yes, a literal money pouch below the belt. And you thought cargo shorts were bad. You stretch, yawn, and settle into a corner chair as the couple finally retires. The candle is snuffed. Darkness settles in. You can hear every rustle, every creak of wood, every whispered breath. The moment is anything but magical. And still, this was how it happened. Messy, awkward, necessary. Sex in Tudor England was not sexy. It was ritual. It was duty. It was survival. And now that you've smelled, seen, and squelched your way through this introduction, you may be wondering, can it get worse from here? Oh, absolutely. You trudge along a creaky oak floor, your feet wrapped in scratchy wool socks that aren't helping much against the chill. The candle you're carrying flickers with each step, casting soft dancing shadows along the walls of the dim Tudor household. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs, a deep rattling sound that seems embedded in the wood itself. Ahead of you, a door yawns open into what passes for a bedchamber. And by bedchamber, let's be clear, it's more of a shared, multi-purpose sleeping arena. You step inside and freeze. There's already a couple asleep on a rope-strung bed, a child curled at their feet, and a large, wheezing dog occupying what little space remains. Welcome to the most private moment you'll never have. Privacy, in Tudor England, is something you dream of but rarely enjoy. Even if you had your own bedroom, a rare luxury, you likely shared it with siblings, servants, or aging parents, sometimes even guests. And no one thought it odd. The idea of separating sleeping arrangements for dignity or discretion was still several centuries away. You take a moment to absorb your surroundings. The air is thick with the scent of human closeness, sweat, wood smoke, unwashed linens, and possibly boiled cabbage. There's a chamber pot tucked beneath the bed, which seems to have been used recently, judging by the sharp tang wafting upward. You shift awkwardly, feeling like an intruder, and marvel at the oddity of chastity in a world that offered so little solitude. There are whispers about chastity belts in this time period, often involving rusted metal contraptions and heavy padlocks, but historians still argue whether they were real or merely symbolic. Some believe they were novelty items, exaggerated in engravings and moral sermons, while others suggest they were occasionally used but rarely practical. Either way, if you're imagining some poor soul trying to undress their beloved, only to be greeted by a literal locked gate, you're not far from the anxieties that fed these myths. And yet, In this world of bodily proximity and clanging locks, ideas of virtue ran deeper than mere mechanics. A woman's virginity was a family asset, like a prized horse or inherited silver. Her value in marriage was inextricably linked to whether her body had remained untouched. Never mind the fact that men rarely held themselves to the same standard. Hypocrisy thrived under Tudor eaves. You creep back out of the room, careful not to wake the snoring occupants, and find yourself in a narrow hallway where you can hear someone whispering prayers behind a thin wooden door. This was not an age of casual hookups. Marital intimacy was governed by ritual and community expectations. In many cases, even the act of consummating a marriage was performed under some degree of surveillance. And no, that's not just poetic license, people watched. The practice of bedding ceremonies was astonishingly literal. You arrive at a small manor house now, drawn by the sound of murmuring voices and the soft thud of wine cups on oak tables. Inside, a wedding has just taken place. The bride and groom are flushed from dancing, their faces glazed with mead and modest terror. And now, it's time. The guests follow them to the bridal chamber. Yes, follow, carrying candles, laughing nervously, and throwing ribald jokes like confetti. The bed has been freshly laid with clean sheets and lavender sprigs. A priest offers a final blessing. Servants remove the couple's outer garments, often helping undress them down to their shifts. Then the newlyweds are tucked into bed and expected to consummate the marriage. In full view? Not exactly, but the point is made. The audience might linger for a kiss or the first positioning before withdrawing with smirks and candlelight. In some traditions, the bed curtains are closed and the entire household listens for sounds of action. Sometimes they even return in the morning to inspect the sheets for blood, as proof of virginity. You lie back now on a bench by the fire, stunned. Can you imagine someone checking your sheets for political or financial purposes? This was not intimacy as we know it. This was spectacle. Quirky fact: in some elite households, they'd keep a signed bedding certificate confirming that the marriage had been consummated, witnessed by lords, clergy, or noble relatives. The idea of faking it wasn't unheard of, either. One account tells of servants dabbing a chicken's blood on the linen, just in case things didn't go according to plan. Yet for all the fanfare, these rituals were deadly serious. In the Tudor legal system, a marriage wasn't valid without consummation. If the couple didn't do the deed, the union could be annulled, which meant losing lands, titles, inheritances, or worse, incurring royal wrath. You shift again and find yourself inside a modest rural home now. Wattle and daub walls, a thatched roof, smoke curling from a single hearth. In this setting, there's no ceremony. Just two people huddled together beneath a tattered wool blanket, trying to stay warm and awake long enough for duty. But even without an audience, there's still pressure. Religious pressure, primarily. The church had rules, oh, so many rules about when and how you were supposed to have sex. Mondays and Wednesdays? Often off limits. Religious feast days? Forbidden. Lent and Advent? Absolutely not. Fridays? Nope. Out of respect for Christ's crucifixion. Sundays? Maybe, but only if you were married, sober, and it wasn't raining. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were followed. Was it dogma for the elite, or did peasants mostly ignore the specifics? Parish records suggest that punishments for illicit relations were meted out regularly, but so were bribes and strategic confessions. You lean your head against the cool plaster wall and sigh. Even the idea of passion seems exhausted in this context. Between the moral surveillance, cramped quarters, and unpredictable hygiene, sex was rarely about desire. It was often mechanical, purposeful, transactional, a means to produce heirs, or just keep a husband happy enough not to stray. And if he did stray, well, that was usually her fault. Which brings us, reluctantly, to gender dynamics. You find a worn book beside the hearth, dog-eared, handwritten, full of advice for young wives. It tells them to be obedient, silent, and cheerful, to endure discomfort, to please their husbands without complaint, to view intimacy as both a wifely duty and a spiritual test. Fun. You close the book and return to your imaginary Tudor bed, your body tired and your mind a little sore from the sheer weight of it all. Even within marriage, there was no guarantee of kindness. The line between consensual and coerced was thin and poorly defined. A husband had legal rights over his wife's body, rights that were rarely challenged, let alone questioned. So what happens when everyone knows what's happening? No one gets privacy, and pleasure is more whispered about than experienced. You end up with a culture where sex is always present, always humming beneath the surface, but rarely spoken of with honesty. A culture that builds ornate rituals around repression, builds marriages on economic deals, and then tells women that their worth is tied to purity and their silence. And yet, despite all this, it persisted. Love letters still found their way through latticed windows. Laughter still spilled from taverns. Illicit rendezvous still took place in stables and gardens and shadowy corners of the church. Desire, even in Tudor England, found its way through the cracks. You blink through the candle smoke curling lazily in the air as you follow the distant clink of goblets and laughter. You've wandered into yet another Tudor house, this one noble, judging by the wall tapestries an absurd number of peacock feathers sticking out of decorative jugs. It's wedding night again, but this time the room hums with quiet anticipation. People are gathering. A wide wooden door creaks open, revealing the blushing couple. The bride's cheeks are as pink as the rosewater she bathed in earlier, while the groom looks equal parts smug and terrified. Around them, family members and high-ranking guests, none of whom you'd want anywhere near your bed, cheer with well-worn phrases and slap shoulders with the joy only wine can afford. This is no ordinary send-off. This is the beginning of a bedding ceremony. You watch as the bride is led, not alone, but accompanied by a parade of women who giggle and whisper in her ears. They help remove her outer layers, petticoat, sleeves, embroidered bodice, until she stands in her shift, the linen clinging nervously to her skin. Across the chamber, the groom undergoes a similar ritual, surrounded by men who shout bawdy rhymes and share tips that seem less than helpful. Eventually, they are brought together, often for the first time in private, even though there's very little private about it. The curtains are drawn around the bed, a thin veil of woven cloth that won't block out the crowd's excited whispers. It feels like the entire house holds its breath. You stand there too, awkwardly, because what else can you do? This deeply intimate act has been turned into something communal. No, performative. An entire society watching from behind veils of etiquette and tradition, waiting to see if the new marriage is truly sealed. And when you think it couldn't get more invasive, someone calls out the medieval equivalent of, "Make it official." Depending on the family, some guests linger for the confirmation. Others trust the morning after evidence, the infamous stained sheets, displayed like a trophy. In some parts of Europe, this custom involved parading the linens through the streets, a practice so deeply unsettling that you wonder whether even the dogs averted their eyes. Quirky detail? There were cases, especially among royals, where the couple would merely lie next to one another, fully clothed, while witnesses remained in the room long enough to check that nothing scandalous happened prematurely. Then the room would clear. Allegedly. There's at least one account of courtiers hiding behind tapestries or peeking through holes in the wall. Makes you grateful for creaky floorboards. You quietly tiptoe away, trying not to imagine what stage fright must have felt like with a bishop and your in-laws listening on the other side of the curtain. Now you're in a rural hamlet, crouched beside a hearth where a group of older women, mothers, aunts, neighbors, are offering unsolicited advice to a visibly overwhelmed young bride. They speak in euphemisms. The flower must be plucked, the field sown, the gate opened. One woman, clearly the blunt one in the bunch, mimics a rather awkward gesture using a pair of turnips. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. This was sex education, Tudor style, coded, confusing, and cloaked in metaphor. The young were rarely told what would happen, only that it must happen, and soon. Meanwhile, if the marriage was political, as it often was among the elite, the stakes were even higher. Fertility was a national concern. The pressure to produce heirs wasn't just family business, it was kingdom business. No children? That could mean annulment, scandal, or worse, an invitation for foreign interference. Just ask Henry VIII. Historians still debate whether Henry's obsession with producing a male heir was purely political or rooted in deeper psychological insecurities. What's clear is this: when Anne Boleyn failed to deliver a son, she was accused of adultery and witchcraft, then executed. Subtlety was not the Tudors' strong suit. You're now stepping into a smaller home, perhaps a merchant's or an affluent yeoman's, and you overhear hushed gossip from a pair of servants folding linens in the corner. They talk about a recent wedding where things didn't go to plan. The groom may have been, well, unready. And the bride, young and unfamiliar with what was expected, was left confused and frightened. Here's where the idea of sexual duty comes into sharp focus. In Tudor society, especially among the upper classes, consummation wasn't about mutual desire, it was obligation. Failure to perform could bring shame not just to the couple, but to their families. People were dragged to ecclesiastical courts over it. Yes, there were literal courts for sexual dysfunction. You pause by an open window, where a neighbor is loudly recounting how her cousin's marriage was annulled because her husband couldn't render the debt. You shiver, not from the cold, but from the sheer pressure of that phrase. A marital debt, something owed. And just like a debt collector, society waited, eyes narrow and ledgers open. But what happened when someone dared to break these expectations? You follow a narrow alley and step into the makeshift courtroom of a small parish. A man stands before a panel of clergy accused of refusing to bed his wife. His defense? He did not find her pleasing. The room shifts uncomfortably. The priest raises an eyebrow. Meanwhile, a similar case from another village has a woman standing trial, this time for shamelessness. Her crime? Appearing too eager, too flirtatious, too present in her husband's bed. There was no winning. You were either cold and frigid or overly lustful and corrupt. The tightrope was razor thin. You leave the courthouse and wander past a barn where a couple whispers in the shadows. They aren't married. They aren't supposed to be here. But desire rarely respects boundaries. Their hands shake, their breath forms clouds in the air, and their eyes dart toward the house. It's risky and thrilling. This is the other side of Tudor sexuality, the quiet rebellion. For every sanctioned bedding ceremony, there were a dozen stolen moments, hidden kisses, and passionate letters slipped into baskets of bread. And then there were the scandals. You find yourself at a manor where servants are buzzing with news. A noblewoman was caught with her riding instructor. Or maybe it was the tailor. Details shift, but the scandal sticks. She's being sent to a convent. Men, of course, faced fewer consequences. A lord with a mistress might earn raised eyebrows but rarely punishment. In fact, it was so common that some kept mistresses as openly as they kept falcons. Still, you catch glimmers of connection, true ones. A hand lingered on too long, a laugh shared behind a curtain, an awkward, heartfelt confession in a chapel corridor. There was love. It just had to elbow its way through centuries of regulation, expectation, and obligation. You sit down now on the edge of another rope-strung bed, hearing it groan under your weight. The sheets are rough, the air is chilly. Outside, the moon casts long shadows across a garden wall, and you think, not for the first time, how on earth did anyone manage to fall in love here? But they did. Through the noise, the ceremony, the rules, and the scrutiny, they found one another. Amid all the watching eyes and whispering voices, someone reached across the sheets and said, "Stay." And sometimes, that was enough. You lean against the cool stone wall of a Tudor kitchen, your eyes adjusting to the flicker of the hearth. The coals crackle lazily, throwing light across a bundle of herbs hanging from a low beam. Parsley, rue, pennyroyal, and something suspiciously mossy. You're not here for soup. You're here to discover how people tried not to make babies in a time when contraception was more wish than science. Because in Tudor England, sex was everywhere. But reliable birth control? Practically non-existent. That doesn't mean people weren't trying. Oh, they were trying. Behind every closed curtain and discreet side room, there was someone chewing bitter roots, whispering charms to the moon, or stuffing themselves with something that probably belonged in a stew instead of a womb. Right now, you're watching a middle-aged woman grind dried mandrake root into powder. She's muttering a rhyme under her breath, something about barren soil and sealed gates. She sprinkles the powder into a warm wine and hands it to a nervous-looking girl who gulps it down with eyes squeezed shut. Is it effective? Possibly. Is it safe? Almost certainly not. But options were few, and desperation was a constant. You walk into a separate room where a local healer, half respected, half feared, is instructing a woman on a wound-binding poultice. It's a combination of mashed figs, vinegar, and soot meant to be applied, well, internally. You look away. Historians still argue whether these methods had any real preventative power or whether the placebo effect was working overtime. Some of the substances, like silphium in the ancient world, had real chemical impacts, but by Tudor times, most of the effective herbal knowledge had been muddled by folklore, church doctrine, and plain bad luck. Still, people passed along recipes in hushed tones. Pennyroyal tea was especially common, a toxic herb that could induce miscarriage, but also kidney failure. A classic double-edged plant. You imagine sipping it and immediately regretting everything. Then there were pessaries, homemade vaginal plugs soaked in ingredients from beeswax to acacia gum to, yes, crocodile dung. That last one was imported from earlier Egyptian practices and stuck around like a bad smell. Literally. Now you're in the apothecary's workshop where labeled jars line the walls. Tansy, Queen Anne's lace, mouse droppings. You blink at that last one. Apparently, rodent residue was sometimes used in mixtures meant to dry the womb. You can't help but imagine the poor soul applying it while trying to look seductive. There's an open ledger nearby with handwritten notes in Latin and shorthand. You see, coitus interruptus scribbled between dosage instructions for laudanum and powdered deerhorn. Ah, yes, withdrawal. As ancient as it is unreliable. Tudor men, like their modern counterparts, employed the method with mixed success. One bawdy joke from the period reads, "He left the feast before the pie was served, yet still found himself accused of gluttony." You hear laughter in a nearby chamber. A few men are sitting around a pitcher of ale, boasting loudly about their romantic escapades. One claims his seed only flows when the moon is fat. Another insists that eating roasted onions 3 times a day renders him sterile. A third brags that he's learned the secret of placing a cold stone against his anatomy before intercourse to prevent conception. You're not sure if that's bravery or frostbite. Meanwhile, the church offered less than helpful guidance. Technically, sex within marriage was to be open to life. Using barriers or intentionally avoiding conception was considered sinful. That didn't stop anyone. It just added guilt into the already uncomfortable mix. Which brings you to one of the most bizarre and tragic parts of Tudor reproductive history, infanticide. When all the herbs failed and all the methods proved fruitless, some women, often young, unmarried, and utterly alone, resorted to desperate measures. Concealed pregnancies, stillbirths hidden in fields, or infants quietly buried. You find yourself now in a parish record hall, leafing through a list of grim court cases. One entry reads, Martha, aged 17, accused of concealing the death of a child born out of wedlock, sentenced to whipping and pillory. Another, unnamed maid of 15 years, body discovered near the river, evidence of childbirth found posthumously. The punishment was swift and merciless, but the cause? Often poverty, shame, or a lover's abandonment. There were few protections for women, especially those whose pregnancies were not sanctioned by church or court. You step out into a garden now, where an elderly woman sits beneath an apple tree, stringing together beads of garlic and whispering protective charms over them. She's a wise woman, one of the community's unofficial midwives and fertility advisors. Her remedies are passed down orally, refined with local knowledge and survival instinct. But even these women had to tread carefully. Too much success in controlling fertility, or too many miscarriages clustered around them, could bring suspicion. Some were accused of witchcraft. A midwife who knew too much about pregnancy could easily be reframed as someone who cursed babies rather than delivered them. You shift uneasily, remembering how quickly love and medicine turned into accusations in this time. Let's not forget condoms. Yes, they existed. Sort of. Early condoms were made from sheep intestines or chemically treated linen tied at the base with ribbon. Not exactly your modern latex luxury. They were uncomfortable, reusable, yes, washed and reused, and primarily intended to prevent disease rather than pregnancy. You observe a nobleman in his study, reading from a curious manuscript. It's a translated treatise on venereal dangers, and it recommends the use of a sheath during consorting with prostitutes. He folds the parchment carefully and places it in a drawer alongside a suspiciously dainty linen pouch. Condoms weren't discussed openly, of course. Using them carried a whiff of promiscuity and moral decay. But in the back rooms of brothels and city inns, they were known, traded, and, when available, used by those who could afford them. Now, crouch beside the fire again. You're watching a midwife boil a cloth in oil, let it cool, and then instruct a young woman to use it as a barrier. It's crude, painful, and probably ineffective, but it represents a kind of ingenuity born of necessity. Quirky fact, there are recorded cases of women wearing amulets made of dried hair testicles, believing they would ward off pregnancy. Others wore coral beads, carried stones blessed by saints, or tied knots in their hair to close the womb. Of course, some believed that simply bathing in cold water after intercourse could do the trick. Others jumped up and down 10 times or ran backward around a tree. Desperate times, desperate cartwheels. Historians still debate how much of this was belief versus tradition. Were these methods trusted? Or were they just the only options in a world without reliable science? Maybe a bit of both. You sit quietly now, the fire dimming, the room cloaked in the sleepy hush of late night. You reflect on the sheer effort it took to avoid pregnancy, an effort that was often ignored by law, scorned by religion, and punished when it failed. And yet women shared their knowledge, whispered secrets at the well, passed down old recipes, comforted one another after yet another accident. Men, too, played their part, though often with less understanding and more superstition. The truth is, they were trying to control something they didn't yet understand, biology wrapped in mystery, magic, and fear. And in that uncertainty, they cobbled together a toolkit of herbs, myths, and whispered warnings. Not because they didn't want to love, but because loving without planning could cost your reputation, your home, or your life. You stretch your legs, now sore from crouching on uneven flagstones, and make your way out into the night. The stars overhead flicker coldly, but the air is still. Somewhere a child cries, somewhere else lovers whisper, and beneath it all, you feel the fragile, stubborn pulse of humanity, trying always to bend nature just slightly to its will. You step out of the cottage garden and make your way down a rutted path into the heart of Tudor London, drawn by the flickering lanterns and the vague sound of coughing, wet, hacking, and somehow ever-present. The air, already thick with smoke and human residue, now carries something heavier. You catch a whisper on the wind. The French disease. Your stomach turns a little. Sex may have been constant, but so were the consequences, and among the most feared was syphilis, Tudor England's favorite cautionary tale, wrapped in boils, madness, and whispered shame. You turn into a physician's shop, a dark, cluttered chamber that smells of stale herbs and something metallic. An aged doctor with trembling fingers stirs a concoction in a pewter bowl while dictating treatment notes to a wide-eyed apprentice. You edge closer to read the parchment and see words like mercury rub, bloodletting, and boil lancing. The ink is smudged, but the fear is clear. The French disease, now widely believed to be syphilis, was the era's great sexual scourge. It first hit Europe in the late 15th century and spread like wildfire through cities, courts, and battlefields. By the time of the Tudors, it had already acquired a reputation of demonic proportions. The name French disease wasn't exclusive to the English. Various countries blamed each other. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Russians called it Polish disease. Everyone pointed fingers. You're reminded of a historical game of hot potato, except this one ends in pustules and dementia. You glance at a woodcut print on the wall, a grotesquely swollen man clutching his groin while angels hover above and demons tug at his feet. It's both religious warning and medical horror poster. That's how the Tudors saw venereal disease, punishment for sin wrapped in divine symbolism. A man limps into the physician's office now, moaning softly. His legs are pocked with ulcers. His face bears the scars of old infections. He's led to a bench where the doctor begins preparing a mercury vapor bath, a cure believed to draw out the poison through sweat. You back away quickly. The treatment might kill you faster than the disease. Mercury was the go-to option for syphilis, and by go-to, we mean horribly toxic and mostly useless. Patients would be rubbed with mercury ointment, made to breathe the fumes, or take it orally in horrific dosages. Teeth fell out. Gums bled. Hair vanished. Some patients went mad. Others died before the disease did. Still, for many, it was worth the risk. Because the symptoms of late-stage syphilis, terrifying. You slip into a convent infirmary now, where a woman sobs quietly into her hands. Her nose has collapsed inward, a sign of tertiary syphilis. Her mind wanders, her sentences unravel. The nuns murmur prayers over her while dabbing her face with vinegar-soaked cloths. Quirky fact: Tudor wigs weren't just a fashion statement. They were often used to cover baldness caused by syphilis. High foreheads and powdered perukes were less about beauty, more about disguise. And it wasn't just the poor. Nobles, poets, bishops, even kings were suspected to suffer in silence. Rumors swirled around court figures who aged too quickly or retired mysteriously from public life. Historians still argue whether King Henry VIII himself had syphilis. Some point to his leg ulcers, mental instability, and repeated stillbirths in his marriages as possible indicators. Others argue those symptoms fit better with diabetes or another chronic illness. But the rumors stuck, staining even royal beds with implication. You find yourself now near the Stews of Southwark, the city's unofficial red light district across the Thames. It's nighttime, and the lanterns sway gently in the breeze, casting their glow over half-dressed figures leaning in doorways. Business is brisk, but not blind. Prostitutes here know the risks. You pass a wooden plaque nailed beside one door, listing house rules. Among them, no man be served who showeth signs of pox. It's a grim measure of self-preservation. The pox was common slang for syphilis, and clients showing symptoms were either turned away or, more often, welcomed if they tipped high enough. These women had little choice. Infection could mean a slow, agonizing death, but starvation was quicker. Many rolled the dice nightly. Still, some tried to protect themselves. You overhear one woman boasting of her new linen sheath, steeped in vinegar and tied with ribbon. Others apply herbal pastes or swallow bitter brews before work. All were trying to outwit a disease no one yet understood. You step back into a tavern now, where men drink heavily, laugh louder than necessary, and whisper gossip between gulps. One mentions a friend rotting from below. Another jokes about seeing his nose slide off mid-sentence. The laughter is forced. Everyone knows someone. Disease wasn't polite or discreet. It was disfiguring, loud, and impossible to hide for long. That fear hovered over every flirtation. Yet somehow, people kept reaching for one another. You slip into a parish record office, where scribes note down yet another burial. The cause of death is vaguely listed as wasting illness or fever decline. It's easier that way. No one wants to write died of pox next to a noble name. But it didn't end with syphilis. Tudor England had a whole rogues gallery of sexually transmitted ailments, gonorrhea, chancroid, and a host of unnamed inflammations lumped together as the burning. Doctors, midwives, and barbers did their best, which is to say, they mostly made things worse. Bleeding was popular. Cupping too. Some practitioners even tried inserting leeches directly. You wince just thinking about it. Others applied poultices of butter and herbs, believing that cooling the skin would calm the humors. Meanwhile, astrologers claimed certain constellations increased the risk of infection. You watch one elderly man consult a chart before advising his client to abstain until Jupiter left Scorpio. You exit the tavern and walk under the moonlight, reflecting on the sheer chaos of it all. Disease, shame, folklore, and desperation twined together into a system that punished desire and offered no real protection. And yet, people persisted. They married, they loved, they strayed. They risked death for a moment of connection. They whispered secrets and prayed for mercy. It's easy to look back and shake your head. But consider this. What would you do, knowing that pleasure could bring pain, but loneliness brought a different kind of ache? You settle now on a stone bench by the Thames, where the wind carries the faint toll of a church bell. Someone behind you is coughing again. You don't turn. You already know what that means. And tomorrow there will be another lover, another promise, another gamble. Because even when sex was terrifying, forbidden or fatal, it was never optional. You wander deeper into the maze of Tudor society, this time through the quiet corridor of a noblewoman's private chamber. If private means separated only by a curtain from her maid and a persistent draft. The windows are narrow slits in the stone, letting in just enough gray light to highlight the lacework on her camise, the thick braid of her hair, and the distant look in her eyes. She's young, 14, maybe 15, and today she's getting married. You sit on the edge of a carved wooden chest, its lid cracked where it's been slammed shut one too many times, and watch her fidget with a silver ring. It's new. Her husband is not. This is the beginning of her story, a tale woven not with joy or romance, but with expectations. Because in Tudor England, virginity wasn't a personal virtue, it was a public currency. A girl's maidenhead was her family's honor, a commodity traded in negotiations that had little to do with her wishes. You think about that word, maidenhead, so poetic, so medieval, and yet it carried the weight of a blood-stamped contract. She has no real understanding of what's expected of her. Perhaps her nursemaid offered vague warnings, or her mother gave her one of those sad half-whispered talks where euphemism does all the heavy lifting. But there's fear in her eyes. Fear that she'll do something wrong, that she won't bleed properly, that she'll disappoint a man 3 times her age. And she might. Because here your value begins with silence and ends with proof. You follow her to the great hall, where a marriage is being formalized. Candles flicker in iron chandeliers. Guests murmur behind fans. The groom is flushed from wine and pride. The bride? She's barely audible. She recites her vows in a tremble that hardly stirs the air. She doesn't know that this marriage is not a finish line, but the beginning of a life lived under scrutiny. Her fertility, her obedience, her chastity, these are her currencies now. You remember from earlier, the public bedding ceremony? Well, this time there's even more at stake. Not just honor, but inheritance. If she doesn't conceive, tongues will wag. If she does, and it's a girl, they'll wag anyway. She's expected to become pregnant quickly and frequently, despite the pain, the risk, and the sheer physical toll. And heaven help her if her husband has been, shall we say, generous with his affections elsewhere. She could contract something without even understanding what it is. You follow her through the months to come. Mild sickness, swelling feet, whispered advice from midwives about quickening. Her body becomes a site of surveillance. She can't eat certain foods, can't walk too far, can't think too much. If the child is lost, it will be her fault. And all this began with her virginity. You step away from the manor and pass through a village lane where another young woman is drawing water from a well. She wears no rings, no brocade. Her cheeks are ruddy from labor. She hums to herself until the baker's boy saunters past and makes a crude joke about her loose skirts. She stiffens, embarrassed. In towns and countryside alike, virginity was weaponized. If you were unmarried and female, you lived in a permanent state of scrutiny. A wrong glance, a late return home, a pregnancy out of wedlock, and suddenly you were ruined. Quirky fact? There were documented cases of midwives or wise women performing tests to determine a girl's virginity. Some claimed to know based on walking posture, others by eye color. None of these were accurate, but that didn't stop them from being believed. Historians still argue about how these tests were perceived. Were they trusted medical assessments or just tools to control and shame? Either way, they left little room for error. You find yourself now in a small village church, seated quietly in the back. A priest drones on about the virtues of modesty. He reads from a sermon titled, "On the Unspotted Bride." His tone is gentle, but the message is sharp. purity is next to godliness. And impurity? That's a straight road to damnation and social ruin. You glance at a young girl beside her mother. Her face is drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She's absorbing every word, her eyes flicking from the altar to the doorway, as if hoping for a way out. She won't find one. Back at the manor, the noblewoman is in her confinement room now, resting before childbirth. She's pale, sweating, whispering prayers. The chamber is dim, quiet but for the crackling fire and the murmurs of two midwives preparing linens. Her husband is not present. He's hunting or dining or visiting his mistress. You look at the girl and think of all she has endured. The performance of chastity, the pain of proving it, and now the risk of dying in the act of proving she was worth marrying at all. And here's the catch. Should she die in childbirth, her virtue will be praised more than her survival ever was. One midwife leans in and says softly, "Be brave, my lady." As if bravery could fight off hemorrhage, infection, or fever. Now you're standing in the corridor of a monastery-turned-school, watching a group of adolescent girls being educated in the virtues of maidenhood. They read from a text that instructs them to avoid eye contact, to never touch a man's hand unless married, and to keep their legs always crossed while seated. The instructor doesn't smile once. You glance at the back of the classroom, where one girl doodles a heart in the corner of her parchment. She's already lost. Virginity wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Not through understanding, but through fear. And men, you ask, what about their chastity? You walk into a university hall now, where a group of young men boast about conquests, debate which inn has the best ale and the most accommodating barmaids. The tutor raises an eyebrow but says nothing. Boys will be boys, right? You find a ledger in the back room, parish fines, all listed in tight script. Women fined for fornication, for bearing bastards, for seduction. Very few men are listed. The imbalance is glaring. One entry reads, Anne Whittle, maid, sentenced to public penance for fornication, ordered to wear a white smock and stand at church doors. Humiliation as moral correction. The double standard was built into the foundation. A man's promiscuity might be whispered about, maybe even admired. A woman's? It was the end of her social viability. You pass again through a town square, where a crowd gathers around a makeshift stage. A young woman stands barefoot, holding a placard that reads whore. Children throw spoiled fruit. She doesn't cry, not anymore. And somewhere, in a manor nearby, a man brags about how he took her maidenhead, like plucking a rose. No one punishes him. You finally reach a quiet garden, overgrown and thick with ivy. A forgotten corner where two young girls sit beneath a tree, whispering secrets. They're barely older than 10. One asks, "Do you think it hurts?" The other shrugs. "My sister said it does, but you're not supposed to say so." And then silence. Just the breeze. Just the heavy, invisible burden of virtue, passed down from mother to daughter like an heirloom no one wants, but everyone's expected to wear. You drift now through the narrow corridors of another manor house. Stone walls rise on either side, cloaked in damp tapestries and shadows. Through a slightly ajar door, you peer into a small chamber where a young woman lies flat on her back, unmoving, arms at her sides, eyes fixed on the dark wooden beams above her. The bed creaks faintly with each shallow breath she takes. Her husband, a man twice her age, twice her size, and precisely none of her choosing, grunts softly with effort, finishing what he calls his marital duty. When he rolls off, she turns her face to the wall. No eye contact, no words. This is what it means to be a good wife in Tudor England. Sex wasn't something she desired. It was something done to her. An expectation, a burden, a penance. You sit quietly in the corner, out of sight, and the silence hangs so thick you can hear the flicker of the lone candle by the bed. That single flame, struggling against the darkness, could be a metaphor. But in her world, it's just the last light before a long, uncomfortable sleep. Here, within marriage, consent wasn't a factor. A woman's body, once pledged at the altar, became her husband's right. No matter her pain, no matter her fear, no matter her wishes, the law offered no comfort. Rape within marriage wasn't recognized as a crime because the marriage contract itself was seen as perpetual consent. A grim logic, bound in ink and tradition. And what about pleasure? Surely there were moments of mutual affection, of real tenderness? Of course. Not every bed was cold, but such warmth had to bloom under pressure, like moss growing in the cracks of a stone prison. You watch the woman rise slowly, wrapping herself in a plain linen shift. She moves with practiced detachment, careful not to disturb the man already snoring beside her. She pads over to the small wooden chest by the hearth and removes a folded cloth and a vial of rosewater. She begins to clean herself, methodically, silently. There's no shame in her face, just exhaustion. And now you're in a different home. A yeoman farmer's cottage on the edge of a wooded grove. It's smaller, rougher. The walls are bare, and the bed is straw-stuffed and low to the ground. A woman sits with a bowl of herbs at her feet, crushing them with a wooden pestle. She glances up as her husband enters. They exchange a tired smile, one of habit, maybe even affection. But even here, even in the quiet spaces of relative contentment, the sexual dynamics are weighted. She lowers her eyes, knowing tonight is his night. Her role is not to refuse, only to endure. Quirky fact: some Tudor advice manuals encouraged women to lie still as the grave during intercourse. Movement, noise, or, heaven forbid, initiative were seen as signs of lewdness. One writer warned women not to wriggle like a fish on a hook, lest they tempt their husbands into sinful excess. And so they lay like stones, hoping it would be over quickly. You hear a faint tune from outside, a lullaby maybe, or a hymn. A young girl sings to her doll beneath the stars. She has no idea what awaits her in the years ahead. The marriage, the bed, the expectation of stillness. It's tempting to think only the poor suffered. But wealth didn't buy freedom, it just bought better sheets. In the court of Henry VIII, the same patterns played out in gilded rooms and beneath silk canopies. You find yourself now in a royal palace, amid velvet drapes and ornate furniture. A lady-in-waiting whispers gossip as she sews an embroidered handkerchief. Lady Eleanor wept after her wedding night. They say she hasn't smiled since. The other women nod, their fingers busy with thread and secrets. Historians still argue about the extent of women's agency in these arrangements. Some assert that noble women learned to manipulate the expectations, using their position to influence, to withhold, to maneuver behind the scenes. Others insist the boundaries were too tight, the consequences too steep. Either way, few escaped the weight of marital duty, even queens. Catherine of Aragon was praised for her piety and submission. Anne Boleyn was executed in part for being too assertive, too sensual. Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Anne of Cleves was cast aside. Catherine Howard was executed. Catherine Parr survived, but barely. The royal bedchamber was a battlefield dressed in brocade. And what of the women who couldn't be still? Who refused to pretend? You walk now through a market square at dusk. The stalls are closed, but the air hums with residual energy, snippets of gossip, lingering glances, the smell of overripe apples. A woman walks briskly through the square. Her chin is high, her eyes sharp. She's known here, too known. She speaks her mind. She laughs too loudly. Some say she enjoys the company of men. Others say she's cursed. You follow her home to a narrow house with worn steps and cracked windows. She lights a candle, removes her shoes, and begins to write in a small, battered notebook. A poem, perhaps, or a prayer. She's not married. She never will be. The local priest calls her unnatural. The baker's wife calls her dangerous. But the butcher's apprentice lingers too long at her doorway. She's chosen solitude over submission. And for that, she's a threat. Because when a woman claims her body as her own, she disrupts everything the Tudor world depends on. You turn the corner and enter a church. Stone columns rise like forest trunks, and stained glass windows cast fractured light across the pews. A confession is underway, murmured voices, trembling syllables. "I'm sorry, Father," a woman whispers. "I tried to resist, but he said it was his right." The priest sighs. "Your penance is 10 Hail Marys. Remember to serve your husband faithfully." She nods, not because she believes him, because what else can she do? You exit into the cold morning light, your breath fogging before you. The sky is pale gray. Somewhere, a rooster crows, and you wonder how many women walk through their lives like ghosts. bodies without ownership, souls bound by law and scripture. Not all men were cruel, not all marriages were grim, but the structure itself was cruel, and the silence it demanded even more so. You sit now by the riverbank, watching the water lap at the muddy edge. A heron lifts into the sky, slow and graceful. It makes no sound. And you think of her, back in that chamber, lying still beneath a man who never wondered if she wanted him, who assumed her silence meant consent. But silence is never consent. It's survival. And she is still surviving, somewhere beneath all the lace and linen and lies. You step back into the warmth of the kitchen, the fire crackling as if it's trying to drown out the murmurs from the hall. You can hear them, women in silk and servants in linen, gossip flowing faster than the mead. The Tudor household isn't just a place of hearth and harvest. It's a stage, and the playbill always reads scandal, hypocrisy, and a surprise visit from the vicar. In a world where women were expected to be passive and pure, there were always some who didn't quite follow the script, and others who did, but found themselves condemned anyway. Let's talk about the women who didn't lie still, the ones who stirred desire, or, heaven forbid, acted on it. Mistresses, maids, and morally questionable queens, they were both desired and despised, adored and annihilated. You ease into a well-appointed parlor now, where a nobleman sits beside his wife. She's doing embroidery, her fingers tight on the needle, her gaze lowered, but attentive. He, meanwhile, laughs loudly at something a young maid has said while pouring wine into his cup. The girl's smile is too practiced. She knows what this is. He knows she knows. His wife? She knows too. But she says nothing. Because here, infidelity was an open secret. So long as you had the right last name, a man of means could take a mistress with little consequence. His peers might joke about it. The church might wag a finger gently. But no one would demand his public humiliation. His wife might be bitter, but she was expected to suffer and be silent. You hear footsteps now, servants in the corridor, whispering about the new scullery girl. She's too pretty, they say, too quick with a curtsy. She's already caught the eye of the master. She should have known better. But should she? Because here's the twist. Even when she says no, it might still happen. And even if it's not her choice, it will be her fault. Women like her, maids, cooks, seamstresses, were particularly vulnerable. Living in close quarters with the men who employed them, they were often subjected to unwanted advances, or worse. If they became pregnant, they were blamed for seduction. If they resisted, they were dismissed for impertinence. You walk down the hallway to the laundry room, where a young woman folds linens with trembling hands. She's late with her cycle. She hasn't told anyone. She knows what happens next. A whisper becomes a rumor, and a rumor becomes a ruin. You step now into a church court, where women are tried not for theft or violence, but for morality. The charges: loose behavior, lewd conversation, fornication. There's one accused woman now, a tavern maid. She stands barefoot in the dock, accused of bedding a married man. She denies it, says he forced himself on her. The judge frowns. "Why did you not scream?" he asks. "Why did you not resist?" Her answer: "I did." No one believes her. Quirky fact. In some parishes, women punished for promiscuity were made to wear a special bridle or iron mask with a spiked tongue plate. Others were forced to sit outside church in the repentant stool for hours while neighbors passed and spat. The idea wasn't justice, it was spectacle. And that's the cruelty of it, the way punishment was gendered, the way society picked apart women who stepped outside the narrow bounds of Tudor decorum. It didn't matter whether they were queens or cooks. Once you were suspected of desire, the walls started closing in. Even queens weren't immune. You find yourself now in a finely appointed corridor of Whitehall Palace. Candles glow along the walls. Tapestries hush the echoes. You see her, Catherine Howard, fifth wife of Henry VIII. She's young, barely 16. Pretty, playful, surrounded by courtiers who smile too broadly and bow too deeply. She laughs, too loudly. She dances too freely, and soon she's accused. Of what? Of unchastity before marriage. Of liaisons with courtiers. Of secrets and letters. Some claims are true, others are imagined. But it doesn't matter. She is arrested, she is interrogated, She is executed. The axe falls quickly. The judgment falls harder. And Henry? He marries again. Business as usual. Historians still debate whether Catherine was naive or calculating, whether she knew the danger or was simply swept into it. But it's clear that once her sexuality was exposed, she had no way to survive. That's the paradox of the Tudor mistress. Wanted but disposable, praised in private and punished in public. And the hypocrisy didn't end there. You make your way to a brothel now, one of the legal stews across the Thames in Southwark. The room is dimly lit, the air warm and perfumed, the furniture surprisingly tasteful. A woman lounges on a cushioned bench. She's not ashamed. She's pragmatic. "This is the only job that pays enough to feed 3 mouths," she says, lifting her chin. "I'll not be scolded by men who come knocking at my door after dark." She's taxed by the crown, protected sometimes by the city, and yet she lives on a knife's edge. At any moment, a new law, a new mayor, a new bishop could declare her an offense to God and close the stews entirely. She's made a life in the cracks of Tudor morality, but it's a precarious one. Another woman enters, younger, quieter. She's new. Her eyes dart around the room, looking for escape routes. The older woman puts a hand on her shoulder. "Keep your secrets," she whispers. "That's how you survive." You step outside now into the street where a preacher thunders from atop a barrel. He speaks of virtue and modesty, of Eve and the fall, of Jezebels and wicked temptresses. His gaze falls heavily on the crowd, especially the women, especially the poor ones. And behind him, his mistress waits in a nearby alley, arms folded, expression unreadable. The hypocrisy hangs in the air like wood smoke. You sit now in a quiet tavern corner. The candles burn low. A group of older women share stories, some true, some embroidered. One tells of how she faked chastity with a drop of lamb's blood on wedding night sheets. Another confesses to running off with a stable boy and returning ruined but happier. They laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it's the only power they've got left. And there, beside them, sits a young girl, listening, learning. She hears every story, every warning, every act of defiance. She nods slowly, tucks a strand of hair behind her ear, and files it all away. Because that's how it passed down. Not through books or sermons, but through whispers. Through lived experience. Through the quiet strength of those who survived long enough to share it. And in those whispers, desire still lived. Not the kind sanctioned by church or court, but the real kind. Secret, soft, stubborn. You walk now through the garden again, past dew-drenched hedges and the first blush of dawn. The world is waking up. A rooster crows. A door creaks open. Somewhere, a couple makes love in defiance of everything. Expectation, condemnation, danger. Because even in Tudor England, with all its rules and punishments and double standards, people still reached for one another. Still loved. Still hoped. Still dreamed of a life not watched, not judged, not punished, just lived. You're crossing the muddy expanse of London Bridge now, the morning fog hugging the river and muffling the sounds of the waking city. Boats creak along the Thames, and market stalls begin to clatter into motion. But you're heading somewhere just outside the reach of respectable cobblestones, beyond the northern limits of official morality, where the rules are bendable and the business is brisk. Southwark. Here, the air is thick with the smoke of cook fires, the scent of spiced meat, ale, and something else entirely, a musk you can't quite name but know instinctively. Laughter echoes down alleyways. A fiddler tunes his strings, and just behind a tavern sign shaped like a swan, you see it. A row of neatly painted buildings, each with red curtains hanging from the windows and carved wooden signs swinging above the doors. You found the stews. That's what Tudor England called its brothels. Stews. After the bathhouses where such dealings were once technically not supposed to happen. But over time, the lines blurred. The baths faded, the beds remained, and so did the business. You approach the entrance of one such house, and the madam, dressed in a fine if slightly tattered gown, greets you with a tilt of the head. She's efficient, calculating, and not unkind. She's running a business. She offers a tour. You accept. Inside, the floors are surprisingly clean, the beds made, the windows open just enough to let in the light without inviting in scrutiny. "There are rules here," the madam explains. No fighting, no underage clients or girls, no drunken violence, everyone pays in advance. And most astonishing of all, it's legal. Well, sort of. For decades, the stews were licensed and regulated. The Bishop of Winchester himself oversaw many of them. Yes, you heard that right. A bishop, which is why the women who worked here were sometimes called Winchester geese. Quirky and disturbing, isn't it? Morality and vice walking hand in hand, led by clergy. You sit in the common room now as a few women prepare for the day. One laces her bodice tighter. Another powders her face with a mixture of crushed eggshell and rosewater. A third adjusts her garter and jokes with a cook who brings in a tray of oatcakes. They're not meek. They're not ashamed. They're working. And yet, you can't help but notice how carefully they monitor the street outside. The legality of their work depends entirely on the current political wind. One day, protection from the city, the next, a raid. It all depends on who's been preaching lately. Historians still debate whether the brothels offered real autonomy or just a different form of exploitation. Some argue the regulated nature of the stews gave the women more safety and control than elsewhere. Others see them as institutions that profited off desperation. You're ushered into a smaller room now, the walls covered in crude drawings, some mocking, some sincere. A young woman no older than 17 sits brushing her hair. She tells you her name is Anne. It probably isn't. She speaks openly, without drama. She grew up poor. Her mother died when she was 12. A baker's apprentice promised her love and brought her to London. He vanished within a week. Anne tried to work in service, scrubbing floors, cleaning chamber pots, but the wages were too low to survive. She turned to the stews out of necessity. And oddly, she says she found something like a home. There's camaraderie among the women here. Rules, even a kind of hierarchy. Some have regulars, wealthy merchants, even nobles. Others cater to sailors and travelers. Anne shrugs. It's not worse than starving, she says, and better than being touched by a lord who calls it honor. You don't know how to respond. You follow her down the hallway to a locked cabinet. Inside are bottles, oils, perfumes, tinctures to dull pain, potions that might prevent pregnancy. There are condoms too, made of animal intestines, tied with ribbon, soaked in vinegar. It's not romance, it's risk management. One bottle catches your eye. It's labeled Mother Truelove's Soothing Elixir, a mix of poppy extract and alcohol used to dull nerves before or after particularly rough customers. The women here aren't under illusions. They laugh at men's compliments. They steel themselves against aggression. Some have scars. Some carry secrets. All of them carry the knowledge that they are both needed and reviled. You make your way outside again. The streets now crowded with onlookers, some leering, some disgusted, many pretending they don't see what's right in front of them. That's the dance of Tudor hypocrisy. Men visit the stews. They laugh, tip, and return. Then they stand in church and condemn the very women they paid. They preach purity while paying for flesh. They marry maidens and return here by moonlight. And worse still, many women don't even work in official brothels. Some are mistresses kept in shadowy rooms by wealthy men. Others are assaulted, used, and discarded by those too important to accuse. And some walk the streets, entirely unprotected, risking death for pennies. You now walk past the stocks where two women are locked by the ankles, their heads lowered in shame. A sign above them reads, "For lewdness." Bystanders jeer, throw eggs, toss insults. You recognize one of the women. She served you ale last night. No one mentions the man involved. Quirky fact? In some towns, women accused of prostitution were sentenced to be ducked in the river, tied to a chair and lowered beneath the freezing water until they confessed. It was torture masquerading as purification. Even more bizarre, some cities required brothel workers to wear special badges or colored clothing. In London, it might be a yellow hood. In York, a bell pinned to the dress. Public branding, shaming through fashion. You pass through the legal offices of the Bishop's Court now, reading transcripts from actual hearings. One woman testifies that she only took up sex work after her husband abandoned her and her children. Another was falsely accused by a jilted lover. The punishments are varied: fines, whipping, public penance, sometimes even imprisonment. Rarely, if ever, is the man punished in kind. Historians still debate whether the courts offered any form of protection or simply extended the state's control over women's sexuality. Either way, justice wasn't blind. She was watching closely, and she knew who to blame. You follow a narrow alley now to a tiny chapel where a woman kneels in silent prayer. She wears a tattered shawl and grips her rosary tightly. Her lips move, but you can't hear the words. She was once a mistress to a nobleman. He left her when she became pregnant. Her child died shortly after birth. Now she asks God for mercy. For what? She's not even sure. Her body? Her choices? Her survival? You sit beside her for a moment, the candlelight flickering on the worn stone floor. There's a quiet dignity in her posture, a weariness beyond her years. You think of all the other women like her, seen as sinners, used as scapegoats, punished for the sins of others. And yet, they endure. Back on the bridge, the wind has picked up. The Thames rolls beneath you, cold and gray. You glance across the water toward Southwark, the red curtains still fluttering gently in the morning light. It's a place of contradictions, of survival, of danger and laughter and whispered resistance. You wonder what Anne is doing now. Preparing tea? Writing a letter? Listening to a client explain how his wife just doesn't understand him. She'll nod, she'll smile, she'll survive. Because in Tudor England, sex was power, but not always the kind you wanted. And for the women of the stews, that power came with a price, one they paid nightly. Still, behind every curtain, every locked drawer, every stolen moment, there was a story. A life. Not just a transaction. You're walking now through a wind-swept courtyard, shoes slick with mud, the chill biting through the seams of your cloak. In the distance, you see them. Two boys chasing a hoop, laughter echoing as their nursemaid calls them back. But it's not the noise that catches your ear, it's the silence behind a nearby hedge, where a maid whispers urgently to a child, tugging a cap down over tangled curls. That child isn't supposed to exist. You've stepped into the murky world of illegitimacy in Tudor England, a land of half-truths, half-claims, and children who are whole in heart but baseborn by law. It's a term that rolls off noble tongues like a curse. Baseborn, bastardy, natural issue. And yet behind every scandalized whisper is a story. A mother, a father, a night of something more, sometimes love, sometimes coercion, sometimes boredom and wine. You follow the maid into a modest cottage at the edge of an estate. Inside, she cradles the boy on her lap, brushing the hair from his brow. He's perhaps 5 years old, bright-eyed and alert. You'd never know from looking at him that he carries a social mark heavier than any physical blemish. He's the son of a nobleman and a chambermaid. And in the eyes of the law, he's no one. He won't inherit land, he won't carry his father's name. He might, at best, be acknowledged, and only if the father is feeling unusually generous or embarrassingly caught. Still you wonder, what happens to these children? Sometimes they're quietly absorbed into households as servants or wards. Other times, they're fostered by distant relatives or shipped off to monasteries. Some are raised by single mothers under the protection of silence and luck. And others? Well, they grow up angry. You stroll now through the halls of a much grander estate. The tapestries are thick, the air perfumed with cloves and ambition. Here you see a different scene. A well-dressed young man seated at a writing desk, penning a letter with careful script. His clothing is fine, his posture regal. But he is no heir. He is the bastard son of a duke. Acknowledged, educated, funded, but never legitimized. He gets the tutors, the fencing lessons, the poetry books. He may even be given a minor title or a place at court. But the great estates? The name? The political future? That goes to the real son. The one born to the wife, not the mistress. And this young man knows it. Historians still argue about how bastards fit into Tudor society. Some rose high, like Henry Fitzroy, the acknowledged illegitimate son of Henry VIII, who was given the title of Duke of Richmond. Others faded into obscurity, barred from inheritance, quietly tolerated but never truly embraced. You now turn into a small chapel where a priest reads a parish record aloud. A new baptism. Thomas, son of Alice, father unknown. That's the polite version. The other one, born of whoredom. a phrase etched in ink that will follow Thomas for life. Illegitimacy didn't just block legal rights, it created social barriers. A bastard couldn't inherit titles or coats of arms unless specifically legitimized by royal decree, and even then suspicion lingered. Every upward step came with a sideways glance. You sit beside the font as the priest finishes the entry, his face impassive. To him, it's just another name. But to the mother, waiting outside in the cold, wringing her hands, it's everything. She may never marry now. Her chances of securing another position in service are slim. People will call her loose, immoral, wicked. No matter that the father was her master, no matter that she couldn't say no. You follow her down the road later, clutching the infant tight, face hidden beneath a woolen hood. She pauses only once, at a crossroads shrine, and whispers a prayer you can't quite hear. Something about protection. Something about forgiveness. She knows what she's done. Or rather, what's been done to her. And now she lives with it, every step echoing between shame and resolve. You move through the town square now, where gossip flows faster than the ale. Two older women sit on a bench, weaving rushes and trading rumors. Did you hear about the blacksmith's daughter? Aye, and with that traveling piper no less. Not even married. She's ruined, poor thing. But then the third woman leans in. He's the one who left, mind you, and nobody's dragging his name through the muck. And just like that, a thread of quiet rebellion weaves into the conversation. They know the game. They've played it. They know how unfair the rules are. Quirky fact: some noble families went to extreme lengths to hide illegitimate children. They bribed midwives, paid off neighbors, sent infants away under false names. There are entire generations of Tudors who might have carried royal blood and never known it. You pause outside an orphanage now, gray stone walls and a soot-streaked bell tower. Inside, children huddle on wooden benches, some reading scripture, others just staring into space. The matron explains that many of these children are foundlings, left on doorsteps, in baskets, wrapped in linen and prayers. Some are from brothels, she says without flinching, others from ladies' laps. You look closer. Each child carries a different story, some marked by the color of their eyes, the curve of their cheekbones, inherited from someone who will never claim them. But not all illegitimate children were abandoned. Some found ways to rise. You walk now through a bustling merchant's shop. The owner, a portly man with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers, was born out of wedlock. His mother worked in the kitchen of a wealthy merchant. His father was never named. But now, he owns the building, and the building next to it. No point chasing a name, he tells you, dusting off a ledger. I made one instead. His children will never know the ache of being baseborn. He bought their legitimacy with coin and cunning. Still, not everyone could. You stroll into a candlelit hall where a young woman, clearly nervous, stands before a judge. She's asking for child support, what the court calls bastardy relief. The father, she swears, is a gentleman's son. They promised to marry. They exchanged tokens, but now he's vanished. She has no proof, only her word, and her belly. The judge sighs, orders the father brought in. If he admits it, he'll be forced to pay a few shillings a week. If not, the woman may be imprisoned for attempted fraud. Her face falls. She knows he won't show. You step away, weary from the weight of it all, and find yourself in a quiet garden. A woman kneels among the herbs, trimming rosemary and thyme. Her child plays nearby, Guy, giggling as he chases butterflies. She doesn't care what people call her, not anymore. She knows her son is bright, funny, kind. She knows he deserves more than whispers. She knows love makes him legitimate, even if the church does not. You sit beside her for a while, letting the sun warm your face, and realize that every bastard you've met on this journey has carried not just the burden of illegitimacy, but the resilience to live past it. Because no matter how hard the Tudors tried to define worth by bloodlines, by rings and rights and parchments stamped with wax, people still loved outside the lines, still broke rules, still made families from ashes, and often it was the ones deemed illegitimate who turned out to be the most fully, stubbornly alive. You duck beneath the low thatched eaves of a quiet country cottage, the kind whose chimney forever puffs smoke and whose walls feel like they're leaning in on themselves. It's warm inside, but not cozy, because this is a place of waiting, of hoping, of fear so old it's baked into the floorboards. A woman lies on a straw mattress, swollen with child, her hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat, her eyes half open and searching the ceiling for mercy. She's in labor. And it's not going well. There are no doctors here, only the midwife, steady hands, deep creases, and a voice that murmurs encouragement like a prayer, and her apprentice, who hovers nervously with a pot of boiled water. You sit in the corner, quiet and invisible, but your stomach twists with every scream. This is childbirth in Tudor England. And it's brutal. Pain is expected. In fact, it's considered holy. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, says Genesis, and Tudor society took that line and ran with it. To suffer in labor was not only natural, it was righteous. To cry out for relief was human, but to accept it without complaint was womanly. There were no epidurals, no antiseptics, no safe hospitals with clean linens and beeping machines. Just a room with poor ventilation, foul water, a few herbs, and a handful of women doing the best they could with what they'd learned from the ones before them. If things went wrong, and they often did, there were very few options. Instruments were rudimentary at best, long-handled spoons for maneuvering stuck babies, hooks for stillbirths. Yes, hooks. You don't want to know more than that. Even surviving the birth was only the beginning. Puerperal fever, what we now know as postpartum infection, killed many women days or even weeks after delivery. They would seem fine, perhaps even strong, and then spike a sudden fever, convulse, and die. No one knew what caused it. Some blamed cold air, others sin. Historians still debate how much midwives actually understood about hygiene. Some were careful, boiling cloths and washing their hands in herbs. Others moved from birth to birth with the same linens, unaware that they carried death on their fingertips. But still, women trusted them more than surgeons. Male physicians were called in only as a last resort, and they were often terrifying. More interested in heroic interventions than comfort, they'd prescribe bloodletting, cautery, or forced delivery by mutilation. Their presence in the birthroom was as much a sign of doom as of help. You look back toward the laboring woman. Her contractions come closer now. The midwife is calm, but you can see it in her eyes. She's calculating, bracing, ready for anything. Because even if the child survives, there's no guarantee the mother will. And what if the mother dies? That's where the wet nurse enters the picture. You're now sitting in a more affluent household. Thick carpets, polished pewter, tapestries of hunting scenes. A new mother lies in bed, pale but alive. She's not holding her baby. That task has already been passed along to another woman, healthy, young, lactating, and paid for her services. She's the wet nurse, and she's as much a fixture of upper-class Tudor homes as the cook or the chambermaid. You watch her as she settles into a chair with the baby, offering her breast with the ease of someone who's done this before. She hums softly. The baby latches. The mother watches from her bed, distant and blank. Why doesn't she nurse her own child? Because she's a noblewoman. Nursing is considered beneath her, or, more practically, an inconvenience. Breastfeeding can prevent conception, and she needs to be ready to provide another heir. Plus, she has to recover, re-enter society, and maintain her figure. All reasons offered in courtly letters and ladies' guides of the time. Some women were devastated by this expectation, others relieved. Most had no choice. The wet nurse, meanwhile, may have left her own child behind to take this job. She's likely from the countryside, from a family that needed the coin more than the comfort of keeping her home. She'll nurse this baby for weeks, months, sometimes years. She might bond with it, she might not. But the connection is real, physical, emotional, and sometimes inconvenient. You glance at the nurse as she adjusts her bodice, revealing bruises, subtle, old. Her own life may not be gentle. But here she's paid to give nourishment, to smile, to hand the baby back when it cries too much. Quirky fact: some Tudor families employed multiple wet nurses in rotation, worried that too much affection from a single nurse would confuse the baby or bind the child to a lower-class soul. Imagine having your most basic human comfort interrupted because it might interfere with your noble future. And it wasn't just breastfeeding. Wet nurses often cared for the child full-time, bathing, dressing, rocking, even whispering lullabies that would become embedded in that child's earliest memories. The biological mother, meanwhile, might remain a ceremonial figure for years. You wander now through a churchyard, past rows of tiny graves. Many are unmarked. Others bear names and dates barely months apart. Infant mortality was devastatingly high in Tudor England. 1 in 4 babies died before their first birthday. A third didn't live to age 5. That changes how you parent. It changes how you love. You start to understand the quietness of Tudor nurseries, the caution in every lullaby. Don't love too much. Don't name them too soon. Don't hope too loudly. Still, people did. You find yourself now in the upper room of a merchant's house. A young couple stands over a cradle. The baby inside is sleeping, pink-cheeked, perfect. The mother strokes its forehead and whispers a name. Edmund. They've chosen to raise him themselves. No wet nurse, no nursemaid. The decision scandalizes the neighbors. You'll exhaust yourself, one aunt sniffs. It's simply not done. But they don't care. They've already lost one child. This one they will hold, feed, rock, no matter what. You sit with them for a while, letting the warmth of the hearth soften the ache that's built in your chest. And then the baby coughs, just once. The room freezes. You're transported to a scribe's chamber now, where burial records are being updated. So many infants, so many small coffins, each entry made with a flourish that can't hide the reality. Daughter of, son of, stillborn. Each death, a private heartbreak carried into public record. You visit another village, where a woman rocks an empty cradle. Her breast still leaks milk. Her hands move automatically. Her eyes are vacant. She's mourning, but no one will say the word. It's just part of life, they insist. God's will. But grief lingers like smoke. And for mothers without living children, the world becomes quiet in a cruel, echoing way. Wet nurses sometimes took the place of grieving mothers. In a few rare cases, they stayed with the family permanently, becoming a kind of second mother. In others, they disappeared once the child was weaned. Ghosts who had nourished the air and then been sent back to nothing. You cross the threshold of yet another home, this one cold and spare. A woman is nursing 2 children, neither her own. Her pay is small. Her own baby died 2 weeks ago. But her body still produces milk. And in Tudor England, that means she still has value. She closes her eyes as she rocks both infants. One belongs to a nobleman, the other, a merchant. They don't know each other, but they share her warmth, her body, her exhaustion. Historians still argue whether wet nursing harmed children emotionally, or whether it saved their lives in a world with so little safety. Some say it fractured mother-child bonds. Others claim it allowed mothers to survive, to be present in other ways. Still others point out that the entire debate ignores the wet nurse's feelings altogether. You exit into the starlight. It's late now. A barn owl screeches overhead. You've seen birth. You've seen survival. You've seen loss, separation, devotion. In Tudor England, wombs were public domain, breasts tools of industry, uteruses were political, spiritual, economic, and the bodies of women always working, always watched, but also always enduring. The stone walls of the priory echo with a reverent hush. You walk barefoot over the cool flagstones, your breath clouding in the morning chill. Bells toll in the distance, low, solemn, and somewhere a choir is chanting the divine hours in Latin, but your path doesn't lead toward the chapel. You're following the side corridor, toward the dormitories, toward the silence, and toward the thoughts no one is supposed to have. This is where the nuns sleep, and think, and feel. You pause at a wooden door, the iron latch worn smooth from centuries of midnight fingers. You enter slowly. Inside, a young nun kneels beside her narrow cot, hands clasped, lips moving in wordless prayer. But her eyes drift to the open window, where the sunrise spills gold across her face. Her cheeks flush, and her body shifts with a tension that has nothing to do with fasting or faith. In Tudor England, Monasteries and convents were supposed to be safe havens from the sins of the flesh. But desire doesn't die at the altar. It simply puts on a robe and hides behind scripture. You listen to her breathe. It's shallow, rhythmic, broken by a barely there sigh. You know the look of someone remembering a face they weren't supposed to notice. A stable boy, a visiting brother, a fellow sister. Because here's the truth. Monks and nuns were human. And despite vows of chastity, despite locked gates and midnight rituals and endless litanies, sex and longing found their way into these cloistered halls. You drift through the convent's garden now. Lavender, rosemary, marigolds, herbs of healing, scents of the Virgin. But beneath it, always, the pulse of human nature. One nun is scribbling fervently in a leather-bound book. You peek over her shoulder. It's a prayer, mostly. But here and there, tucked between psalms and meditations, are phrases that burn with quiet intensity. His hand brushed mine. My skin remembered. I dreamt of warmth. She's not alone. In male monasteries, it was much the same. Monks kept diaries, too. Some filled with agonized confessions, others with coded references to the brother who sat beside them in the scriptorium. Some cried out to God to take the temptation away. Others didn't ask. Quirky fact? In several surviving Tudor-era confessional manuals, specific questions were listed for confessors to ask monks and nuns about sexual thoughts, dreams, and even nighttime emissions. The church expected struggle. They just didn't want to talk about it too loudly. You pass a cloister window now, where a statue of St. Agnes watches over the courtyard. Her face is serene, eyes raised, hands folded in marble piety. But beneath her feet, hidden in the ivy, is a tiny carving, crudely etched and half-worn by time. A pair of lovers joined beneath a tree. Someone made that. A novice? A groundskeeper? A nun in a moment of weakness? We'll never know. But there it is, proof that even behind the walls of holiness, longing carved itself into stone. And longing wasn't just a problem for the celibate, it was also a weapon. You turn now into a tribunal chamber, where a group of bishops examine a scroll. A nun is being accused of carnal corruption. Her crime? A close friendship with another sister. Too many hours spent alone together. A shared bed, explained as necessity. Too much laughter. Too many letters. There is no proof, just suspicion. Still, she's transferred, or exiled. Or worse, sent into the secular world where her options are few and her shame follows like a shadow. Historians still argue how common same-sex relationships were in monasteries and convents. Some suggest they were widespread, born of proximity and emotional isolation. Others insist they were rare and heavily punished. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in between. Desire existed. Sometimes it bloomed quietly, sometimes it was caught and crushed. You step through the gate of another abbey now, this one in partial ruin, its roof scorched, its windows shattered. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII wiped out hundreds of religious communities. You wander through the rubble, past smashed altars and looted relics, and imagine the lives displaced. Where did the monks go? The nuns? Some took pensions and faded into the countryside. Others struggled to reintegrate, having spent most of their lives in seclusion. A few ended up in brothels, forced by poverty into the very life their vows had tried to escape. You walk along the riverbank now, where a former monk sits carving birds into driftwood. He doesn't speak. He doesn't look up. But beside him, pinned to a folded cloak, is a small wooden cross worn smooth by years of thumb-rubbing. He still believes in something, just not perhaps in the walls that once claimed to protect him. You climb a hillside to a convent turned manor house. The new owner, a wealthy merchant, has converted the refectory into a dining hall and the chapel into a wine cellar. You descend the stone stairs to the basement, where bottles now sit on the shelves where chalices once stood. But in the corner, scratched into the mortar behind an old pillar, is a message. "Forgive me, sister." You sit with that for a while. You wonder who wrote it, and why. Because for all the shame piled onto monastic desire, it was rarely the kind born of malice. More often, it was love, twisted by rules, suffocated by guilt, but love nonetheless. You visit a library now where a stack of forbidden texts lies under a dust cloth. One volume, handwritten and bound in deerskin, is a translation of the Song of Songs, erotic, ecstatic, mystic. Once used by monks for spiritual meditation, it was later banned from some shelves for being too distracting. But it remained popular in monasteries, especially among those who needed permission to feel. You turn the page and read aloud, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine." It doesn't feel like prayer. It feels like poetry. It feels like hunger wrapped in scripture. You pause outside a novice's cell next, where a teenage girl kneels, muttering a litany of saints. She's trying to drown out the feelings she doesn't yet have names for. The warmth she felt when Sister Joanna brushed past her, the thrill of holding hands during Vespers, the guilt that follows. She lights a candle hoping it will burn those thoughts away. It won't. Because you can take away names, take away kisses, but you can't take away the ache for connection. Not in cloisters, not in cassocks, not in silence. You make your way into the archive room where centuries of letters sit tucked into baskets. One catches your eye, unsigned, unsent. It reads, "I know not if I sin by loving thee, but I would rather perish with thy memory in my mouth than live without knowing thy touch again." It's folded in thirds. Kept, not burned, preserved against the very rules it broke. Quirky fact? Some monasteries had codes for censoring letters. Phrases like "our Lord's embrace" or "sisterly affection" were often used to veil romantic language. Sometimes it worked. Other times, it didn't. You head back toward the cloister now, the evening light slanting through arches. The nuns chant Compline. Their voices rise and fall in harmony, pure, unbroken, otherworldly. You pause at a window overlooking the garden. Two nuns stand beneath a tree, laughing softly. One reaches to fix the other's coif. Their fingers linger. Only for a moment. It means nothing. It means everything. You walk away, the bells toll in, and you realize that desire, repressed, redirected, resisted, was never truly absent from these holy places. It just wore different robes. You're standing at the edge of a village square now, the sun just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the uneven cobblestones. A wooden scaffold creaks gently in the wind. It's empty for now, but the crowd is gathering, slowly, cautiously. Not because someone's being executed today, but because someone is being watched. The whispers have already started. "Did you see what he wore?" Said she was a man. Walking like that, asking for it, surely. You step forward into the strange, dangerous space where gender, sexuality, and public order collided in Tudor England. This is where we talk about the people who didn't fit, who refused or failed or simply couldn't perform the rigid expectations of what it meant to be a man or a woman, and the punishment that came with it. You make your way into a small thatched cottage where a woman is hunched over, pulling on woolen breeches and a linen shirt. She binds her chest tightly with a cloth, tucks her hair under a cap, and checks her reflection in a small piece of polished tin. Satisfied, she slings a sack over her shoulder and heads toward the road. To the world, she is now John. And for good reason. In Tudor England, a woman without a man, father, husband, employer, had few legal protections. But as John, she can travel, she can work, she can speak more freely, perhaps even love. Cross-dressing, though, is not just scandalous, it's dangerous. You flip through a stack of court records now, most handwritten in hurried Latin, some in English. They list charges like disguise in man's apparel or woman in breeches. In one case, a woman named Thomasina, who preferred to be called Thomas, was arrested for dressing as a man and joining a ship's crew. She served for over a year, undetected. When she was found out, she was sentenced to public whipping. Historians still argue whether these individuals were simply disguising themselves for survival or whether they might, in more modern terms, be considered transgender. We may never know. But the courage they showed in stepping outside of prescribed identity is undeniable. You pass through a marketplace where another story unfolds. A man, slender, carefully dressed, gentle in gesture, is standing before a group of tradesmen who jeer and whisper. His voice is soft, his manner theatrical. The butcher makes a lewd joke, the cobbler laughs too loudly. The man keeps walking. He's heard it before. And worse. In Tudor law, sodomy, what they broadly and vaguely defined as unnatural acts between men, was not just sinful. It was criminal, punishable by death. Quirky and terrifying fact, England's first sodomy law was passed in 1533 under Henry VIII as part of a broader effort to define and regulate morality. The Buggery Act made the detestable and abominable crime a capital offense, and it stuck around for centuries. That man walking through the market? If anyone accuses him, truthfully or not, his life could be forfeit. You find a small bookshop tucked behind a row of fruit stalls. The shopkeeper, an older man with ink-stained fingers, closes the door behind you and carefully pulls a leather-bound folio from beneath a loose floorboard. It contains poetry, some devotional, some secular, some not at all subtle, love poems, between men, between women, often coded, always risky. He explains that these were circulated quietly, copied by hand, sometimes tucked between pages of psalms to avoid suspicion. The language is cautious, my heart's twin, the friend of my soul, your touch like spring's mercy, but the meaning is unmistakable. You step into a private chapel next, where another story unfolds, one of spiritual love, or at least that's what the bishop prefers to call it. A priest has been summoned for questioning. A younger clergyman has accused him of corrupt affections. They were close, too close. Letters were found, shared evenings, late-night walks. The bishop frowns and recites the usual line, "Temptation walks even in holy places." There will be no official charge, just a quiet transfer, a demotion, a warning. The church preferred to handle these matters internally, when it could. But the threat was always present, and not just for men. You step into a small garden now, where two women sit beside each other on a bench. They laugh softly. One leans her head against the other's shoulder. It looks innocent, sweet. But if someone were to see them too many times like this, if one of them were to write a letter and the other lose it, they could be accused of tribadism. That's the early modern term used by moralists and physicians to describe female-female relations. And while it wasn't criminal in the same way sodomy was, it was heavily stigmatized, viewed as unnatural, demonic even. In extreme cases, it was linked to witchcraft, which is how you end up in another courtroom. This one far darker. A woman stands accused of sorcery, but when you read the testimony, it's filled with lines like, "She lived alone, she never married, she was too close with her neighbor's wife, she had strange dreams." You begin to see that this isn't about magic, it's about fear and control. Many women accused of witchcraft were also accused of unnatural lusts. It was a convenient way to pile on sins until execution seemed like a relief. You walk now through the alleyways of London, where underground communities flourished, not openly, not loudly, but definitely. There were spaces where men could meet under cover of night, taverns with back rooms, riverbanks where glances were traded like currency, brothels where services extended beyond what was written on the placard. Even some noble homes where artists and poets and courtiers lived in a kind of silent understanding. Was it safe? Not really, but it was alive. You pause at a tiny apartment above a tailor's shop. Inside, two men sit beside a fire, legs almost touching. One sketches while the other reads aloud. They've been together for years. No one talks about it. Everyone knows. They are careful. They are invisible. They are in love. And in Tudor England, that is both miraculous and forbidden. Quirky fact, some records indicate that Queen Elizabeth I's court contained several favorites whose close relationships with male poets and noblemen sparked rumor, but were never officially acknowledged. One such figure, Sir Francis Bacon, later wrote about the greatest pleasure being in loving a man who loveth you again. Whether this was romantic or platonic remains debated, but the language tells its own story. You walk now through a prison yard where two men are chained to a post. The charge is buggery. There is no evidence beyond rumor. One confesses, perhaps under duress. The other remains silent. Their fates are sealed. Public executions were rare for this crime, but they happened, and when they did, they were spectacle. Warnings, morality theater, and yet people kept loving, quietly, fiercely, without permission. You return now to the scaffold from earlier. The sun is high, The crowd has dispersed. Nothing happened today, but the wood creaked just the same. You sit on the edge, looking out over the square, and think of all the people who lived outside the script, who dared to love, to wear, to be something Tudor society told them they couldn't. Some were punished, others vanished. A few were remembered, usually as cautionary tales, but many lived on in the margins, in the letters never sent, in the poems passed by candlelight, in the quiet touch of a hand beneath a pew. You get up, the wind tugging at your cloak, and you whisper a thank you, not for their suffering, but for their audacity, for insisting on being, even when the world insisted otherwise. Because behind every accusation, every statute, every stockade, there was someone who dared to want more than permission. They wanted the truth of themselves, and for that, they were never truly forgotten. The smoke stings your eyes as you move slowly toward the edge of the village green. The scent hits first. Wood, herbs, and something much darker. Burning flesh. People stand in a loose semicircle, not too close, not too far, their faces blank or morbidly curious. The fire crackles high into the air, and above it, tied to a tall wooden post, is the shape of a woman. She's still. Too still. This is not a scene of public execution, it's a message. You're standing at the intersection of lust and fear, in a world where desire, especially female desire, could be mistaken for something monstrous. And in Tudor England, when a woman spoke too freely, knew too much, or refused to stay in her place, there was one word that could unravel her life. Witch. The woman in the flames? She was a healer, a midwife, a widow. Or perhaps she was simply unlucky, but somewhere along the way she made the mistake of being visible. And once gossip started, it needed very little evidence to catch fire, sometimes literally. You turn away from the flames and find yourself in the shadow of a timber-framed house. Inside, another woman rocks gently on a stool, muttering under her breath as she grinds dried herbs. There's rosemary for remembrance, sage for healing, mugwort for dreams. A young wife sits nearby, wringing her hands. She's been barren for 3 years. Her husband is angry. The in-laws are whispering. She's desperate. So she's come here, to the only person who seems to understand. The healer hands her a sachet, tells her to sleep with it under her pillow, tells her to drink fennel tea every morning and bathe with lavender. The advice isn't dangerous. It's half folklore, half comfort. But it's enough to raise suspicion. Because when women have knowledge of the body, especially the female body, it becomes threatening. That's how witchcraft accusations often began. Not with curses or sabbats or black cats, but with common sense. Quirky fact: in Tudor times, midwives were often accused of witchcraft, not because of what they did wrong, but because of what they did right. A woman who helped too many others conceive, or prevented conception, might be praised one week and accused the next. You walk down a dirt path now to a cottage near the woods. Inside lives a widow, 60, sharp-eyed, alone. She speaks little, keeps a tidy home. Children fear her. Grown women envy her. Men resent her. When a cow falls ill or a child develops a fever, someone inevitably remembers that she once gave a neighbor a strange look. A few more whispers, a few more days, and suddenly she's being dragged from her bed at dawn. You see her now, on trial in a makeshift court. She stands barefoot, accused of unnatural knowledge. They say she made a man impotent, that she spoiled milk, that she dances alone at night. She can't prove otherwise. The court isn't interested in proof, just spectacle. A confession would save her from torture. But she refuses. So they press her, literally. Heavy stones placed on her chest, one after another, until her ribs groan. Still she says nothing. Historians still debate how many women were executed for witchcraft during the Tudor era. Some records suggest dozens, others suggest hundreds, many of whom were poor, isolated, and unmarried. And while England wasn't as frenzied in witch hunts as some of its European neighbors, the fear ran just as deep. You step into a church where a preacher warns of temptresses and Jezebels. He speaks of Eve, of temptation, of the woman who opens the door to the devil. A girl in the back pew lowers her eyes. She kissed a boy in the orchard last week. He said she was beautiful. Now he avoids her. Was it her sin or his shame? The preacher doesn't distinguish. He just warns, guard your virtue or risk possession. And so lust, especially female lust, becomes a gateway to evil. Even dreams aren't safe. You climb a narrow staircase to a garret room where a girl of 17 wakes from sleep drenched in sweat. She dreamed of warmth, of touch, of release. She tells her mother, weeping, terrified. By nightfall, the priest has been summoned. The girl is told she's been visited by a succubus, a female demon of lust. She believes it. The priest prays over her, then fasts her, then bleeds her. Because in Tudor theology, desire wasn't just dangerous, it was demonic, especially if it couldn't be explained. You move next to a noble court where a lady-in-waiting is being questioned about charms found in her jewelry box. A sprig of rosemary, a folded note with Latin scribbled on it, a carved stone. She says they were gifts, keepsakes, tokens of love. They say it's witchcraft. What they really mean is she was too clever, too pretty, too beloved, and someone wanted her gone. Quirky detail, accusations of witchcraft were often fueled by jealousy, especially over romantic entanglements. A nobleman's favorite, a maid who caught the eye of the master, easy targets. Witchcraft was a tool to eliminate inconvenient women. But not only women. You walk through a village jail where a man sits slumped in chains. He was accused of using love potions, of seducing the blacksmith's daughter with unnatural charm, of dancing alone in the fields. Is he actually a wizard? No, he's just odd, slight, unmarried, maybe a little too pretty. Men, too, could be dragged into the hysteria, especially if they didn't perform masculinity the way society expected. But women bore the brunt. You visit a pub next where a bawdy ballad is being sung. The maid with herbs, her charms did weave. She plucked his heart and made him grieve. But now she swings and pays her price for playing more than sugar and spice. Everyone laughs. The girl who inspired it, dead 3 weeks. Hanged on suspicion. You leave the pub and find yourself in a quiet glen where an old woman kneels by a stream. She speaks to no one, but her lips move in rhythm. A spell? A prayer? A poem? Does it matter? To her, it's comfort. To others, it could be a death sentence. You walk with her back to her cottage, and she tells you something that stays with you. They're not afraid of witches. They're afraid of women who don't need them. You stay silent, because she's right. In Tudor England, being sexually autonomous, being anything but silent, could get you labeled a witch. To desire was dangerous. To resist desire was unnatural. To control it, unforgivable. And so the fire kept burning, not just in the hearths, but in the accusations, the sermons, the punishments. You walk back to the village green now. The fire has long since gone out. Only the charred post remains. Someone has left flowers, a silent rebellion, a whispered apology, and maybe, just maybe, a promise that one day, women will not be burned for wanting more than survival. The door creaks open with the reluctant groan of old wood. You step inside cautiously, squinting in the dim interior of a Tudor home just after nightfall. There's a candle sputtering on a corner shelf, but mostly it's the firelight that shapes the room, wavering orange and soft smoke curling upward toward the rafters. The scent hits you first, and it is, in a word, unforgettable. Sweat, damp wool, stew, mildew, a hint of boiled onions, and something sharp and sour you can't quite name, until you notice the leather bucket in the corner and the absence of any drainage system whatsoever. Welcome to the hygiene habits of Tudor England, or, more accurately, the lack thereof. You take a step further inside, careful not to brush against the bed linens hanging from a rope overhead. They've been airing out for days, which is Tudor code for probably never washed this season. Maybe not this year. A woman passes you by, tossing a sachet of lavender beneath the bedding and spritzing the corners with a rosewater and vinegar mixture that would make Tudor air fresheners cry for mercy. This is what you do when there's no plumbing, no understanding of bacteria, and very little access to clean water. Forget hot showers or fragrant soaps. Bathing was rare and often discouraged. Doctors believed hot water could open the pores, letting in dangerous miasmas, the invisible, deadly airs they blame for everything from plague to melancholy. So most people bathed sparingly. The upper classes might have a tub wheeled in once a month. The poor, they were lucky to wash their feet on Sunday. And don't get too excited about soap. It existed, yes, but it was often made from lye, ash, and animal fat. Imagine scrubbing your face with bacon grease and fireplace soot, and you're halfway there. You step into a separate room now, dimmer still, where a woman is tending to a basin. She's rubbing a cloth on her underarms, grimacing as she goes. There's no deodorant, of course. Instead, people relied on herbs, alcohol, and perfume. A popular method? Stuffing dried rosemary, thyme, and mint into little cloth pouches and tucking them under the arms or into one's bodice. Some women sewed them into their dresses. Others simply lived with the smell. And it wasn't just the armpits. Everything smelled. Let's talk about mouths. Dental hygiene was minimal at best. Toothpicks were common, made from quills or sharpened sticks, and a popular toothpaste recipe included crushed eggshells, burnt rosemary, and salt. Which is to say, brushing your teeth was like polishing them with sandpaper. You peer into a small cupboard where a pot of tooth powder sits open. Its gritty texture suggests erosion more than freshness. A man across the room flashes a smile, revealing what remains of his teeth, yellowed, crooked, and alarmingly few. Historians still argue whether the Tudors' famously bad breath was as pervasive as often portrayed. Some evidence suggests the diet, low in sugar until later, helped preserve oral health. But once sugar did arrive, tooth decay became rampant, especially among the wealthy. You walk through a market next, where vendors shout over their wares. You pass a perfumer's stall, overwhelmed by the heavy aroma of musk, ambergris, and rose oil. These weren't subtle fragrances. They were strategic weapons. Perfume wasn't a finishing touch, it was a substitute for cleaning. You pause by a man dousing his hands in rose water before greeting a guest. This, too, was part of etiquette. Scent was status. The more you masked your natural odor, the higher your class. At least, in theory. But even the nobles couldn't fully escape the stench. Take Queen Elizabeth first. She was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. Her courtiers doused themselves in cologne and starch, layering fabric over fabric to keep smells at bay. Underneath the silks and ruffs, lice, body odor, and a desperate hope that no one got too close. And speaking of lice, you duck into a bedroom where a comb is being boiled in a pot. It's an elaborate metal thing with teeth close enough to trap what it's meant to find: lice. Everyone had them. Even kings. Even clergy. Women wore linen caps under their hoods not for style, but to try, often unsuccessfully, to contain infestations. Men shaved their heads and wore wigs, which were themselves often swarming. A popular remedy involved applying mercury-based ointments to the scalp and then wrapping the head in cloth. You can guess how safe that was. Quirky fact? There were designated nitpickers. In some households, servants assigned the delightful task of removing lice and their eggs from their employers' scalps, eyebrows, and even beards. You're standing in front of a small mirror now. A man is tweezing fleas from his doublet. He pauses to show you one. Tiny, dark, flattened. These little beasts, he mutters, they love the heat of velvet. Then he crushes it between his fingernails with a faint, satisfying snap. The homes themselves weren't much better. Rushes covered the floors, a kind of medieval carpet made from straw or reeds. But unlike carpets, these weren't vacuumed. They were rarely replaced. Instead, people would sprinkle fresh herbs over old rushes to cover up the smell of rotting food, spilled chamber pots, and whatever the dog dragged in. You watch as a servant scatters dried marjoram across the rushes in a dining hall, wincing as something squelches underfoot. And let's not forget the facilities, or lack thereof. If you needed to relieve yourself, your options were a chamber pot, a communal outhouse shared with your neighbors and often your enemies, or if you were outdoors, a handy bush. In castles, garderobes, essentially vertical shafts, dumped waste directly into the moat or a cesspit. The Thames itself served as a giant toilet bowl, garbage dump, and laundry source. People threw waste from windows with a cry of "Garde l'eau," a warning that often came just a second too late. You follow your nose now to the backside of a tavern, where a row of wooden seats with holes await patrons. There's no privacy, no soap, and certainly no flush. Yet even with all this, people still dress themselves carefully. They powdered their wigs, they painted their faces with lead-based white paste, they rouged their lips and cheeks with crushed cochineal. To be beautiful in Tudor England was to be powdered, perfumed, and faintly poisonous. Take the makeup regimen of noblewomen: foundation made from lead and vinegar, eyebrow darkeners from burnt almonds, eyeliner from soot, blush from mercury. The result, a flawless look and very real risk of tremors, madness, and death. But the alternative, being natural, was worse. To be earthy was to be lower class. Cleanliness might have been rare, but its illusion was paramount. You now find yourself in a bathhouse. Yes, they existed, though by the mid-1500s they were increasingly seen as suspect. Once places of community and hygiene, many were shuttered after being linked to outbreaks of syphilis and other sins. Still, a few survive. You watch as a merchant strips to the waist and lowers himself into a wooden tub. The water is tepid, brownish. He sighs contentedly. His servant pours more water over his head from a bucket. There is no soap, just a rough cloth and elbow grease. Historians still debate how common full-body washing was. Some claim the lower classes bathed more often than the nobles, out of practicality and exposure to dirt. Others suggest that even the laborers relied more on dry washing, scrubbing with cloth and ash, than on actual immersion. Regardless, you're starting to understand why Tudor love letters never mentioned body odor. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. You return to the main street where two lovers pass by, arm in arm. They're laughing. He kisses her cheek and she blushes. You smile but can't help thinking, someone should invent soap. Then again, maybe it's not about cleanliness. Maybe they're just used to it. Maybe their noses have long since surrendered and their hearts don't care. Because even in a world of rot and fleas and vinegar-scented armpits, people still desired one another, still reached out for touch, still fell in love with bodies that hadn't seen warm water in weeks. Maybe that's the most human thing of all. The fire burns low now, sending golden shadows flickering across the timber beams of the chamber you've just entered. It's quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that makes you think something important is about to be whispered. And it is, though not in speech. It's in a folded parchment slipped beneath a cushion. A pressed flower tucked inside. A ribbon with someone's initials. Welcome to the secretive lyrical world of Tudor love letters and the coded language of lust. Because in an era where the wrong word could get you flogged, disowned, or worse, how did people confess love? They wrote. They scribbled. They rhymed. They risked everything for a few lines of verse sealed with wax and sometimes a spritz of perfume. Or let's be honest, animal tallow with lavender if they were lucky. You unfold the first letter. The handwriting is fine, looped, practiced. The ink a little smudged, possibly from trembling fingers. It reads, "To mine own heart's flame, your shadow lingers upon my sleeve, like the scent of June rain, and though I dare not speak your name, it sings in me still." It's unsigned, no address, it's not supposed to be found, but someone kept it anyway. In Tudor England, courtship, especially among the elite, wasn't about spontaneity. It was strategy wrapped in sentiment. Marriages were arranged, alliances forged, dowries debated. But letters? Letters were where feelings slipped through the cracks, and so people got creative. You walk now through a gallery where a noble woman paces slowly, a smile ghosting her lips. She wears a pendant carved with a single flower, cowslip for longing. She drops her fan, and when it's retrieved, something else is passed with it, a folded square of parchment. She doesn't open it here. She waits until nightfall. Then, by candlelight, she reads the verse aloud, barely above a whisper. "I dreamt thee in the orchard's shade, where no eyes saw nor tongues betrayed. Meet me, where night forgets to end." No names. Just poetry. Because this isn't just flirtation, it's subversion. You move through the corridors of a boys' school now, where a tutor lectures on Ovid, quoting The Art of Love, while the students snicker and scribble their own verses in the margins. One writes, "She walked past once, then twice again, each glance a wound, each breath a sin." A clumsy line, but heartfelt and dangerous, because even a poem can be evidence. A letter passed into the wrong hands could ruin reputations. Get a girl dismissed from service, or worse, married off in haste to stop the gossip. So people developed code. A sprig of basil meant hatred. Violets meant faithfulness. A feather quill tied in red thread could mean right me. A glove dropped at someone's feet? That was practically a marriage proposal. Quirky fact? One popular game among Tudor youth was to send cryptic messages using the language of flowers or bits of Latin nicked from Psalms. A few daring souls even encoded messages using biblical chapter and verse, referencing seemingly innocuous passages that, when read carefully, suggested passion, regret, or desire. You find yourself now in a tailor's workshop, where a young woman stitches initials into a man's collar. Not her husband, not even her betrothed. A soldier. One who's leaving soon. She'll tell her mistress it's a commission. But inside the seam, she tucks a note on linen, inked so lightly it'll fade within days. A line from a ballad they dance to, just enough to be remembered, just enough to matter. You move into a bustling inn next, where the tables are crowded with merchants, travelers, and city folk. In a corner booth, two people exchange smiles. One slides a tankard forward, and beneath it, another note. Not everyone wrote in verse. Some letters were practical, bold, honest. I cannot wait till spring. Come when the moon is 2 nights full. I'll wear blue. Simple, direct, still risky, because if a husband found that note, or a servant intercepted it, letters were read aloud in court as evidence of fornication, adultery, or immoral tendencies. Some were forged, others misinterpreted, but many were heartbreakingly real. You're now inside the court of Star Chamber. A trial is underway. A woman stands accused of seducing a minor noble. The letters, read aloud, suggest passion, but also consent. Still, the man insists he was tricked. His family pressures him. The court believes him. She is shamed, fined, removed from court, and the letters, confiscated, added to the archive of sin. You pass through a scriptorium now, where a clerk carefully copies a bundle of confiscated love letters for moral instruction. But he pauses on one, reads it twice. Then, instead of copying it, he folds it gently and slips it into his doublet. Because even a clerk isn't immune to the ache of lost words. You sit in a chamber above a bookbinder's shop. A young man pores over a collection of love poetry, the pages well thumbed. He's memorizing lines to recite to the baker's apprentice, if he can ever summon the courage. He tries aloud, "Thou art the candle I dare not light, lest all my truth burn into sight." Too much? Maybe. But he keeps practicing. You glance through his small collection. Among them, Sir Thomas Wyatt, whose poems at court may have been written for Anne Boleyn herself. Lines like, "And now I follow the coals that be quent from my master's fire so far from their heat." Historians still debate whether Wyatt and Anne Boleyn had an affair. The timing is murky, the implications tantalizing. But the poetry? Sharp, yearning, real. Even kings wrote letters. You're in the royal archives now, reading one from Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn. "My heart and I surrender ourselves into your hands. I hope to kiss you soon." He wrote dozens, tender, awkward, full of ego and desire. Anne replied in her own cryptic voice, always careful, always calculated, because she knew that letters could crown you or cost your head. You pass through a convent again, quieter this time, and find a novice writing in a hidden journal. Her words are chaste on the surface, but beneath the Latin verses you notice subtle variations. In prayer, I imagined her face. In silence, her voice. I feared the bell would ring and steal the moment from me. A different kind of love. Still hidden, still real. Letters weren't just between lovers. Friends sent them too, intimate, affectionate, effusive by today's standards. Women signed with kisses, men with pledges of eternal loyalty. The line between platonic and romantic was often blurred. That was the point. Language itself bent under the pressure of repression. So people built new ways to speak, to feel, to remember. You walk past a row of trees now. On one, initials are carved. E plus M equals TRVL. Not true love. TRVL, a Tudor slang from court for true vow lasting. A secret language, known only to those who needed it. You move toward a bridge at dusk. Two lovers meet halfway beneath the arch. She slips him a ring. He gives her a scrap of fabric stitched with her name. They don't speak. It's all been said before. In notes, in glances, in the margins of a prayer book passed back and forth every Sunday. They hold hands, just for a moment, then part. No witnesses, no proof, only what they carry in their pockets and in their hearts. Because in a world where bodies were owned, observed, and punished, letters offered escape, a way to be heard without being seen, a way to say I love you when you couldn't say it out loud, a way to remember, even when the ink faded. You sit beneath a tree now, twilight deepening as a breeze lifts a corner of parchment caught in a branch. You reach out, unfold it. One final line. If ever my words find you again, let them mean I was yours. The door slams shut behind you, and you're immediately greeted by the unmistakable scent of damp straw, old blood, and vinegar. No, you haven't walked into a butcher's shop. This is a Tudor physician's examination room, or what passes for one. On the bench lies a young man, pale and sweating. Across the room, a physician, bearded, robed, and radiating confidence he perhaps hasn't earned, flips open a heavy leather-bound tome and mutters something about disordered humors. You settle in the shadows, unseen but close enough to smell the boiled leeches in a jar by the hearth. This isn't going to be pleasant. But you came here to learn about Tudor sex education, or more accurately, Tudor miseducation. Because here's the short version. If you were hoping for accurate, empowering, and medically sound knowledge about your body and its functions, you were in the wrong century. In Tudor England, sex ed came with a scalpel, superstition, and a great deal of embarrassment. Let's begin with the four humors. Everything revolved around them: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Your temperament, your health, your libido, it all came down to their delicate balance. Too much blood, you were passionate and prone to nosebleeds. Too much black bile, melancholic and likely to pine after someone who didn't know you existed. So how did doctors treat these imbalances? Easy. They bled you. You watch as the physician ties a band around the patient's arm and nicks the vein. Blood drips into a bowl. The doctor sniffs it, nods solemnly. He is too warm and moist, he declares. Venus hath overrun Mars. Translation? The boy probably had a wet dream. You sigh. There's no such thing as just puberty in this era. If a young man experienced spontaneous arousal, or heaven forbid released his seed while sleeping, it wasn't chalked up to hormones. No, it was a sign that his humors were out of control. That lust had gotten the better of him. He might be prescribed a cold bath, a strict diet, or a course of leeches. Yes, leeches. For lust. For lust. Quirky fact, some doctors advised men to wear amulets made of dried toad parts around their necks to calm the loins. Others suggested applying powdered lead to the genitals. You hope no one ever did both at once. But don't think women got off easier. You walk now into a chamber above a midwife's shop, where a mother is explaining to her daughter, newly engaged, that she mustn't think too much about the wedding night. It will happen. It may hurt. God is watching. That's the sum total of her preparation. Female sex education, if it happened at all, was cloaked in euphemism. Mothers passed on vague warnings. Aunts gave advice through whispered metaphors. Midwives offered a little more, especially about menstruation, childbirth, and woman's troubles. But it was all veiled in mystery. You watch as the girl, now alone, pulls a worn pamphlet from beneath her mattress. It's titled On the Nature of Maidens and the Secrets Thereof. The contents are confusing. It claims that women have hot wombs that must be cooled by marital duty. That failure to marry quickly can cause the womb to wander, yes, wander around the body, causing suffocation, madness, or death. This wasn't fringe belief, it was mainstream. The wandering womb theory passed down from ancient Greece, held strong in Tudor England. Women's bodies were seen as unstable, slippery, prone to misbehavior if not controlled by male guidance and regular, use. You step into a university lecture hall now, where a group of medical students are gathered around a dissected cadaver. The professor points out the uterus, then refers to it as the furnace of passion. He spends more time discussing how to detect virginity than how reproduction works. They've never seen a live uterus. Autopsies on women were rare and frowned upon. Most diagrams were copied from books, filled with guesswork. One popular textbook, widely used, includes a picture of the womb shaped like a tiny seated person. Another shows the uterus as a many-chambered cave, like a beehive. You try not to laugh, but it's difficult. Still, the misinformation wasn't always funny. You visit a monastery turned infirmary, where a young woman lies groaning. Her abdomen is swollen. The physician suspects green sickness, a condition believed to afflict virgins who hadn't exorcised their wombs. The cure? Marriage. Fast. Sex, to be blunt. And if she was already pregnant? Well, now we're in dangerous territory. Sex outside of marriage wasn't just sinful, it was deadly. Unwed pregnant women were often forced into isolation. Some were pressured into dangerous remedies to end the pregnancy. Others were abandoned, jailed, or tried for infanticide if the child didn't survive. There was no proper guidance, no protection, no consent-based education. Just shame, fear, and the vague hope that nature would sort things out. So where did young people learn about sex? You walk into a tavern now, where two apprentices swap tales they heard from their older brothers. They joke about plowing the field and sowing the seed. The metaphors are crude, the accuracy questionable, but it's the closest thing they'll get to a lesson. The only formal sources of sexual knowledge came from the pulpit and the physician's table. Neither offered comfort, and both were drenched in morality. You peek inside a confessional next. A girl admits to touching herself. The priest tells her it's a grave sin, that Satan tempts those who lie in bed too long, that she must pray for forgiveness and avoid idle hands. She leaves crying. Quirky fact? Tudor medical theory suggested that women needed to achieve orgasm in order to conceive. So ironically, while women were told to be passive, they were also blamed for infertility if conception didn't happen, because clearly they hadn't tried hard enough. You now step into a printing press, where a new pamphlet is being rolled out. It's called The Honest, Wholesome Advice for Young Men on the Occasions of Lust. It warns that too much seed spilling will dry the brain, soften the bones, and lead to an early death. One paragraph claims that a man who spends his youth in fornication will be unable to hold a sword properly by 30. You watch as a young man buys it anyway, more curious than convinced. Because despite the fear, the shame, the awful drawings, people were still curious. They still wanted to understand, still wanted each other. And so they turned to songs, ballads, stories whispered behind barns and shouted from broadsheets. Some ridiculous, others surprisingly tender. One poem you find in a washerwoman's chest reads, "He touched my hand and I was flame, but dared not speak my heart's own name. Yet if he kissed me 'neath the tree, no church nor priest could silence me." It's not scientific, but it's honest. You stop now at a marketplace where a seller hawks charms to cool the loins. Another offers powders to stir the passions. None of them work, probably. But people buy them anyway. You find a boy and girl behind a stall, holding hands, wide-eyed. They're not sure what to do. They know what they want, but not how or whether they're even allowed. There are no diagrams, no discussions, no lessons about consent or pleasure or safety. Just rumors. Dear, a body that feels what it feels. You sit with them a while. Listen. Remember. Because beneath all the ridiculous advice, the bleeding, the leeches, the boiled herbs and scolding sermons, there were always people trying to figure out how to be human, how to connect, how to love. And sometimes, even with all the misinformation, they managed to do just that. You rise now from the healer's bench, stepping out into the twilight. In your hands, a note from a midwife, a ballad from a baker's daughter, a laugh from a tavern, and the silent ache of every youth who ever wondered if what they were feeling was sinful or sacred, or both. And you think, maybe sex education didn't exist in Tudor England, but sex confusion? That was universal and timeless. The corridor ahead is cloaked in velvet. Not the rich kind that whispers of royal luxury, but the heavy, airless hush that clings to court palaces long after the monarchs are dead. You place one foot in front of the other, the flagstones beneath you polished smooth by the slippers of queens and the boots of executioners alike. This is the heart of Tudor power, the royal bedchamber. And if you've made it this far, you already know. Sex in Tudor England was rarely romantic, rarely private, rarely even pleasurable. But nowhere was it more politicized, theatrical, and perilous than in the bedrooms of the monarchy. Because here, desire could crown you or kill you. The door before you is painted deep red, its latch worn by the countless hands of maids, physicians, spies, and lovers. You press it open and enter. The room is warmer than expected, draped in tapestries showing mythic beasts, bloody battles, and awkward cherubs. The bed, a carved monstrosity, dominates the space, canopied, curtained, imposing. This isn't just a piece of furniture, it's a throne in horizontal form, a stage, a battlefield. You're not alone. A woman sits near the hearth, wrapped in furs. Her eyes are lined with kohl, her lips carefully tinted, but she's trembling. She's Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, barely out of childhood when she married a king who was bloated, ailing, and paranoid. Her mistake? Loving someone else, or appearing to. Or being too joyful, too visible, too alive. It's difficult to know what's true. The records blur, the testimonies contradict. But one thing is certain. When Henry discovered her supposed infidelities, she was sentenced to death. Not because she betrayed a man, because she betrayed a king. Because in Tudor England, royal sex wasn't about pleasure. It was about power. And the royal bedchamber? It was perhaps the most dangerous room in the kingdom. You step through a memory now, an earlier one. A younger Henry, married to Catherine of Aragon, pacing his chamber with restless fury. They've been married for years. She's had child after child, but only one, Mary, has survived. He wants a son, and when Catherine cannot give him one, he starts to look elsewhere. To Anne Boleyn. And with that glance, that ache, that infamous spark, history is rewritten. He petitions for divorce. Rome refuses. He breaks from the church, creates a new one. Declares himself head of the Church of England. All to sleep with and marry a woman who might bear him a male heir. That's how powerful royal sex was. It could cause a schism that reshaped Europe. Anne eventually gives him Elizabeth, but not the son he craves. She's arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Trumped up, whispered, ludicrous. She dies by sword. Quirky fact? Anne Boleyn's last request was for a French executioner, famed for being swift. Henry obliged. It was perhaps the last kind thing he did for her. You sit beside the royal bed as Henry sleeps restlessly, muttering in his dreams. The sheets are soaked. His leg, ulcerated and oozing, twitches beneath the covers. You wonder how many women were forced to smile through nights like this. By the time he marries his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, Henry is more spectre than man. His appetite for food and flattery greater than for touch. Catherine outlives him, but not without scars of her own. You drift now to another bedroom, Edward VI's, Henry's long-desired son, a boy king who ruled only briefly before dying of illness. His bed remains untouched by scandal, but you can feel the tension that always hovered there. Produce an heir, produce stability, fulfill the fantasies of your father's desperate bedroom. He never got the chance. Then comes Mary, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon. As queen, she tries to restore Catholicism, marries Philip of Spain, but the union is cold, political, strained. She has no children, suffers from what might have been phantom pregnancies. Her bed becomes a symbol of national anxiety. Her failure to conceive, a theological crisis. And finally, Elizabeth. You stand now at the foot of her bed, vast, untouched, and famously empty, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana. She wrapped herself in chastity like armor. Her refusal to marry became a political stance, a source of power, but also a cage. People questioned her womanhood. Whispers persisted that she was not truly whole, that she was frigid, that she had lovers in secret, that she was somehow unnatural. But Elizabeth knew the cost of royal intimacy. She watched what happened to her mother, to Catherine Howard, to any woman who tied herself too closely to a man. So she withheld, or appeared to. Historians still argue about Elizabeth's personal life. Some believe she had romantic affairs, particularly with Robert Dudley. Others think she preserved her virginity completely, choosing sovereignty over desire. But whatever the truth, her choice to stay unmarried became a symbol. England itself was her spouse. Her body belonged to the realm. No other Tudor monarch lived such a deliberate contradiction. Both a woman and a ruler in a world where those identities were often seen as incompatible. You walk now into the back corridors of the palace where the servants' gossip runs thicker than wine. They whisper about lords and ladies sneaking through secret doors, about illegitimate children born to courtiers and then quietly adopted by noble cousins, about royal mistresses, yes, but also about the moments no one talks about. The queen's tears, the king's fumbling, the nights when the bed stayed empty and everyone knew but no one spoke. Because in Tudor England, everyone watched the bedchamber, but no one truly saw. The linens were cleaned daily, the sheets inspected, the Queen's Chamberlain recorded her whereabouts by the hour. Every absence noted, every malaise treated with suspicion. Was she ill? Was she with child? Was she barren? The pressure was constant, the stakes enormous. You find a ledger now, dated 1543. It details a courtier's reward, lands and coin, granted in thanks for facilitating reconciliation between their majesties. A marriage counselor? A spy? A panderer? Unclear. But it's written in the margins. The king slept with her again. That alone was worth a knighthood. Even the act itself, so private for most, was public here. Witnessed not in person, but through servants' schedules, pregnancy rumors, and diplomatic reports. There's a letter from a Spanish ambassador. It is said the king did not visit her bedchamber for a fortnight. They speculate dissatisfaction. Imagine your sex life being international gossip. You're now in a quiet antechamber, a servant's room where a young maid folds linens and recites a list. A queen's bed, one for the prince's cradle, one for the mistress's chambers. She pauses, looks around, then adds, and one to be burned, because some things should not be seen again. The royal bedchamber wasn't just the site of seduction. It was surveillance, performance, diplomacy, and danger. Desire didn't belong to you here. It was a currency, a liability, a legend. And yet, even here, even beneath the crushing weight of duty and history, people still longed, still kissed, still hoped for something more than ceremony. You exit the palace as dawn breaks across the lawn. The air is fresh for once. You look back at the great windows of the royal wing. They're dark, still, but behind them once lives were shaped, broken, conceived, ended. And now the palace is quiet, the bed is cold. The sheets folded. History remembers the wars, the laws, the crowns. But tonight, you've traced the echo of something more fragile, more human. What happened in that bed was never just about love, but it was about being alive. Even in Tudor England. Now, as your eyes grow heavier and the shadows stretch longer across the floorboards of history, you begin to let go of the flickering torchlight and whispered secrets of the Tudor night. The laughter behind lace curtains fades. The fires of suspicion and gossip die to embers. You're left with the soft creak of floorboards, the rustle of rushes, the low hum of the past settling back into silence. Feel the air grow cooler as you step away from the court, from the alleyways, from the candlelit bedrooms and stone-walled cells. The weight of corsets and velvet, of guilt and ritual, slips from your shoulders like the final sigh of a closing door. Let the voices that echoed, lovers and liars, queens and courtesans, priests and poets, fade into a single hush. They're resting now, as you should be. Their time is over. Their stories, tangled and trembling, return to dust and parchment. All that remains is the stillness of your breath, the quiet thrum of your heart, the peace of knowing that while history was harsh, you are here now, safe, warm, and very much in a different world. The fire has burned low. The candle is out. You've made it to the end of this long night. And the rest, dear listener, is silence.